Hello. Tonight, you will be listening to John Lewis Esposito's lectures about Islam from the Great World Religion series, starting from Islam, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow.
The images and realities of Islam and of Muslims are multiple and diverse. This diversity is seen in a number of phenomena worldwide. In the many cultures in which Islam is to be found, from Africa to Southeast Asia, from Europe to North America. In the diversity of women's dress, educational and professional opportunities, and participation in mosques and societies, which differs widely from country to country across the Muslim world. If women in some Muslim societies are fully covered in public, cannot drive cars, and are sexually segregated, women in many parts of the Muslim world wear a rich variety of clothing styles. Drive cars, ride motorcycles, are among the top students in universities, serve in government, have been prime ministers or president of Turkey, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, and are to be seen in the professions. We will discuss this further in our class on women. The diversity is also seen in politics. In Turkey, Algeria, Jordan, Egypt, Kuwait, Yemen, Pakistan, and Malaysia. In all of these countries, we see Islamic activists peacefully pressing for the implementation of religion in state and society. And members of Islamic organizations have been elected to parliaments, served in cabinets, been prime minister. At the same time, extremist groups have engaged in acts of violence and terror. We see diversity in social action. Islamic organizations, associations provide a host of social services, inexpensive and efficient educational, legal, and medical services in the slums and many lower middle class neighborhoods of Cairo, Algiers, Beirut, Mindanao, the West Bank, Gaza. On the other hand, terrorists, in the name of Islam, hijacked commercial airliners and flew into New York's World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon in Washington, resulting in the loss of some 3,000 lives. The hijackers who committed this act reflected a religious radicalism that has threatened many governments and societies in the Muslim world, and as we've seen also, Europe and America. The geographic, cultural, and religious diversity of Islam reflects its status as a world religion with a global presence and impact. Islam is the second largest and among the fastest growing of the world's religions. Some would argue that it is the fastest growing. The more than 1.2 billion followers can be found in some 56 Muslim countries, extending from North Africa to Southeast Asia, and as minority communities from Europe and America to China, Thailand, and the southern Philippines. Muslims then include many peoples, many races, languages, ethnic groups, tribes, and cultures. Only a little more than 20% of the world's Muslims are Arab, and yet most people equate Islam with the Arabs. The majority of Muslims live in Asia and Africa. The largest Muslim communities are in Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Nigeria, not one Arab country. Then one could move on to talk about countries like Egypt or Iran. Islam is a visible presence in the West as the second largest religion in Europe, in particular France, Germany, and England, as we'll discuss towards the end of this course, and soon to be the second largest in America. It's currently third largest, after Christianity and Judaism. However, despite the size, global presence, and significance of the Islamic community, negative images, myths, stereotypes, and misinformation about Islam and Muslims continue to abound. Many would say, as a Muslim writer titled his book years ago, many would say today that one can still say that Islam is the misunderstood religion. The focus of this course will be to better understand Islam's role as a religion and as a way of life for more than 1.2 billion Muslims globally. In only 12 lectures, moving from Muhammad to the present, from the 7th to the 21st centuries, we will explore Muslim beliefs, practices, and history in the context of their significance and impact on Muslim life and society through the ages, as well as world events today. Thus, we will want to know the answers to many questions. From what do Muslims believe? Who was Muhammad? How do Muslims view Judaism and Christianity and other faiths? To what is jihad? Does the Quran condone violence and terrorism? Is Islam compatible with modernization, capitalism, democracy? And are women second-class citizens in Islam? And if so, why? The challenges we face are many. As is obvious in such a limited time, we can never hope to do justice to Islam, nor any other faith for that matter. What we can do is provide information that can lead to a basic appreciation of Islam as a faith that has endured, prospered, and informed the lives of many, past and present. It is hoped that this discussion will motivate all who are interested to continue to study and learn in the future, to look to the bibliography that we've provided with the course and the materials. The study of Islam today, and this is a major problem that we face, the study of Islam today is motivated by and cannot escape the threat that radical Islam, that Muslim extremists and terrorists have posed to their own societies and to the West. It's easy for many of us to forget that significant interest in and awareness of Islam in recent decades was not driven by recognition that Islam was the second largest and perhaps fastest growing of the world's religions. Most people weren't even aware of that. But by the challenge and threat of the Iranian Revolution and the impact of what is called political Islam, or more popularly called Islamic fundamentalism. Too often we've seen Islam, the religion of the majority of Muslims, through the lens of terrorism, the actions of a deadly minority. Now, we don't do that with other faiths, and I'll talk about that in a short time. This problem is compounded by, and is especially true post-September 11, in the context of the war against global terrorism, and in particular Al-Qaeda. Thus, appreciation of the faith of the vast majority of Muslims has often been obscured by the tendency to view Islam and equate it with radical or revolutionary movements, their use of violence and terrorism. We don't do this when we encounter the acts of violence and terror committed by Christians or Jews. From Northern Ireland and Serbia, to those who blow up abortion clinics, or the extremists who killed Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, or Dr. Baruch Goldstein, who slaughtered Muslims at prayer in the Hebron Mosque in the 1990s. The majority of us have been raised in a Judeo-Christian culture or society, and we are or know many Jews and Christians. We immediately and instinctively contextualize these acts as the acts of extremists, as aberrations, not representative of the mainstream. Even when we use the word extremist, we mean extreme as compared to the mainstream, as compared to mainstream Judaism and Christianity. We do not have a similar knowledge and experience of Islam and Muslims. And indeed, when we talk about extremist Muslims, it's not as if we instinctively then use the term as extreme as compared to what? As compared to what norm? It's hard for most of us to remember that until the late 1970s, with the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet-Afghan War, Islam and Muslims were invisible, neither a part of our cognitive nor our geographic landscapes. I can vividly recall the reaction of friends and family when they learned that I intended to major in Islamic studies in the late 1960s. You'll never get a job. Why are you studying that abracadabra field? Having studied and taught Christian theology, and in the midst of graduate courses in Hinduism and Buddhism, my decision to study Islam seemed inexplicable. And indeed, I was actually against doing it. What I knew of Arabs and Muslims, basically through a few movies or media, made me think, why would I want to study it? I had to be pressured by the then chair of the religion department at Temple University. However, once I began to study Islam, I discovered a religious tradition with close affinities to Judaism and Christianity, with a rich religious, historical, and civilizational legacy that I had never been told about in school, and high school, and university. For example, while all Muslims believe in God, the Quran, and the teachings of Muhammad, there is a rich diversity of interpretation and cultural practices. I knew neither about Islam, nor did I know about this richness of cultural practices. And indeed, that's true for many people today. They see the axis, like when you engage a new ethnic group. You know, if you meet one Italian and he tends to move his hands a lot and seems emotional, and the only Italian you know, you think, well, all Italians are that way. Well, for many, the few Muslims that they see, the few actions, if they just discovered Islam during the Iranian Revolution and saw people shouting every day, death to America in the streets, the presumption was that these people represented all Muslims. Let's clarify several basic terms as we begin this course. Like Hebrew, Arabic has a consonant-based root system. The Arabic root SLM, from which the word Islam is derived, means submission and peace. It yields three important terms among many: Islam, Muslim, and Salam. Thus the word Islam literally means submission to God and peace, the peace that comes from following God's will, both to individuals and to a society. A Muslim is one who submits, one who seeks to actualize or realize God's will in history, both as an individual and as a member of a worldwide faith community. Finally, Salam, whose root is similar to that of the Hebrew shalom, or peace, is the common greeting that Muslims engage in. Salam alaikum. Peace be with you. Muslims believe that God has given the earth as a trust to humankind, and thus see themselves as God's representatives, God's vicegerent. Quran chapter 2 verse 30, chapter 6 verse 165. God's representative with a divinely mandated vocation to establish and spread God's religion, God's rule on earth. It is on the basis of how God's will in history is realized that a person will be rewarded or punished. Muslims see their community, ummah, as a transnational community of believers, God-ordained and guided, which is to spread the faith and institutionalize an Islamic order, a, if you will, Pax Islamica, Islamic peace, as the Romans had a Pax Romana, to create a socially just society. As the Quran, chapter 3, verse 110 says, "You are the best community ever brought forth for mankind, enjoining what is good and forbidding evil." Islam belongs to the family of great monotheistic faiths, the children of Abraham: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Again, when I was growing up, and for a good deal of my early career, one studied Judaism and Christianity here and talked about a Judeo-Christian tradition, and Islam was put with the other world religions. It was put with Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, you name it. Very few talked about there being a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. But, as many of you will recall from the Bible, Sarah, the wife of Abraham, grown old and childless, told Abraham to have a child with Hagar, her handmaid or servant. Abraham and Hagar had a son, Ishmael. Subsequently, to their astonishment, Sarah became pregnant and gave birth to Isaac. Now, fearing her son Isaac would be overshadowed by Ishmael, who was the firstborn son, that Ishmael would receive, as it were, the inheritance, the senior male of the family, the mantle of leadership. Sarah convinced Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, and they made their way to Arabia. Jews and Christians trace their genealogy to Abraham through Sarah and her son Isaac. Muslims represent the other branch of the family, of the Abrahamic family, the family which descends from Abraham's son Ishmael and Sarah's handmaid, Ishmael's mother, Hagar. While specific and significant differences exist, all the children of Abraham share a profound monotheism, belief in the one transcendent God, creator, sustainer, and ruler of the universe. This belief provides answers to the ultimate existential questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What should I be doing? Why does it matter? Why does it matter whether I'm moral or immoral, for example? All three faiths traditionally affirm a belief in angels, Satan, prophets, revelation, moral accountability and responsibility, divine judgment, reward and punishment, heaven and hell. Thus, for Muslims, Islam is the fulfillment and completion of God's earlier revelations to the biblical prophets of Judaism and Christianity. Indeed, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Mary are central in Muslim scripture and popular piety and practice, and indeed in naming. Ibrahim, Abraham. Musa, Moses. Isa, Jesus. Maryam, Mary. One of my Muslim friends has two sons, Musa and Isa. Moses and Jesus, representing in his own family the Judeo-Christian Islamic family. Islam has had also a significant impact on world affairs. It is a dynamic religion that interfaces and at times competes with other faiths. In contrast to belief in the separation of church and state, Islam for many Muslims represents a more comprehensive worldview in which religion and society, faith and power are closely bound and intertwined. From the creation of the first Muslim community in 7th century Arabia to contemporary times, Muslims have debated and sought to implement God's will in their personal as well as public lives, in their families as well as states and societies. Thus, to be a Muslim was not simply to belong to a faith community or church, but to live in an Islamic community state governed by Islamic law. Many Muslims then see their religion as much more than a personal faith across time and space and throughout Islamic history. Historically, Islam has significantly formed and informed Muslim politics and civilizations, giving rise, as we shall see later, to vast Islamic empires and states, as well as a rich and dynamic Islamic civilization of arts, architecture, science, and medicine. In many ways, for example, the fathers of algebra, major contributions to astronomy, optics. As we shall see later in this course, from the time of Muhammad to the present, Muslims have engaged in a continuous process of applying Islam to the realities of life. Islamic law, theology, and mysticism reflect this complex process. Religious doctrines, laws, and practices result, though, not only from sacred texts, but also from fallible, limited human interpreters, whose conclusions reflect their intelligence, political and social context, and customs, as well as issues of power and privilege. In Islam, as in Judaism and Christianity, the Word of God has been mediated through the words of human beings. Religious traditions, beliefs, laws, and practices are the product of sacred texts and human interpreters, priests, monks, ministers, rabbis, and ulama, that is, Muslim religious scholars. The fact that interpreters and guardians of Islam were males living in patriarchal, male-dominated societies naturally affected the development of Islamic law and thought, especially its impact on women in the family. And we'll have a lot to say about that. While all Muslims believe in God, the Quran, and the teachings of Muhammad, there is then a rich diversity of interpretation and cultural practice. Islamic doctrines and laws developed in response to political and social questions and issues. Who should succeed the Prophet? if somebody committed a major sin, a major negative act as a Muslim, if they assassinated the caliph, for example, what did that mean in terms of their future in the next life? Religion and politics, the development of theology and politics, closely intertwined. And we'll see that same is true for the development of law and for the development of mysticism. Thus, while in one sense it is correct to say that there is one Islam, revealed in the Quran and in the traditions of the Prophet, as we shall now see, Islamic tradition and heritage reveal the extent to which there have been many interpretations of Islam, some complementing each other, others in conflict. Now, again, this shouldn't surprise us. We often say Christianity, but there are in fact many Christianities: Catholics, Lutherans, Methodists, Unitarians. And the same can be said with regard to Judaism. The result has been within Islam the development of two major branches of Islam, Sunni and Shi'i, as well as diverse schools of law, theology, and mysticism, revivalist and reform movements, as well as extremist groups and organizations. As Muslims today, like Jews and Christians, contend with the relationship of their faith to modernity or post-modernity, from issues of faith and history to politics, society, science, and technology, many questions arise. I'll state some here that we'll be pursuing, but there'll be others in the course. Should Islam be restricted to personal life or integral to state, law, and society? Is Islam compatible with modern notions of democracy, secularism, human rights, pluralism, tolerance, in particular concerning the status of religious minorities, non-Muslims, and women? Muslims also face questions regarding the relationship of the Islamic world to the West. Christian-Muslim relations are often seen by non-Muslims through the stereotype of jihad and extremism. In contrast, many Muslims see too often in history a militant Judeo-Christian tradition epitomized by the Crusades, Inquisition, European colonialism, Zionism, and what many call American neo-colonialism. So as you can see, at times there can be rather sharp and contrasting images of the other. But the fact is, and I should point out it, that there are many Muslims and non-Muslims alike who cross those boundaries, who blur that distinction, and can see the acts of militancy of the past, not only in the other, but within their own tradition and within their own heritage. And indeed, that is the challenge that we face in the 21st century, in an era of globalization. To have that level of self-criticism, and if you will, that level of a global, pluralist, self-critical worldview. Critics of the United States' actions in the Muslim world condemn support for authoritarian Arab and Muslim regimes during the Cold War and the post-Cold War, and continuing down to the present. Support by America and Europe, they would charge. Support today for Russia's occupation of Chechnya and its cleansing of Chechnya, and of what many in the Arab and Muslim world charge is a bias or a tilt towards Israel and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and towards India and Indian rule over a Muslim majority population in Kashmir and the current conflict in Kashmir. Such perceptions often lead both sides to perceive an impending clash of civilizations. And indeed, many of us can recall, not only before, but certainly after 9/11. Many, when they asked the question why, it's us and them. They're against everything we stand for. Or They simply hate us. Not that there may be causes for the spawning of terrorism, not to excuse terrorism, but those things that develop terrorism, but rather almost a blind clash of civilization. In recent years, the questions of Islam and the West are joined to those of Islam in the West. Many issues are related to Muslim assimilation in non-Muslim countries. What does it mean to live in a country where Islamic law plays no role? American Muslims, European Muslims have to face this. How do Muslims cope with living in a secular America or Europe that recognizes Christian and Jewish holidays or holy days and customs, but has often been hesitant to accommodate Muslim Friday prayer, holy days, or the custom of women's headscarves? Muslims have struggled to open mosques and schools, as well as faced harassment and hate crimes. And this is particularly increased post 9/11. As we sit here in this part of the 21st century, it is very difficult because we are, on the one hand, looking at Islam, a global religion, the way in which we look at Judaism, Christianity, as we are in this course, or Hinduism and Buddhism. But many of us who are non-Muslims continue, until we learn more about what Islam and mainstream Islam and the vast majority of Muslims believe and stand for, we will continue to view Islam and Muslims through the lens of radicalism. I recently did an online chat on a Muslim site. And I had questions from Muslims all over the world. But suddenly I had a question from someone in the United States, a non-Muslim, who simply said, "Why are you in this conversation with all these terrorists?" There was nothing in the nature of the conversation, the questions, answers, that was advocating violence or terror, etc. It was a sweeping assertion. And I and others have seen these kinds of statements in the media. Many of you have seen statements made, regrettably, by some of our religious leaders, fortunately denounced by most, but people like Pat Robertson and Franklin Graham using phrases like Islam is evil, not extremists are evil, not drawing a line between extremists and mainstream, the very line they would want drawn when it comes to Christianity. Muslims face the 21st century in their original homelands, that is in Muslim countries, or in Europe and America, in a context in which finding answers within historical tradition is a time-honored strategy. As we shall see, like many other faiths, the tension between change and continuity with long-held traditions often produces a struggle and a conflict between conservatives or traditionalists and reformers. Like the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, with its struggle between Protestants and Catholics, the struggle for the soul of Islam today is not only one of lively and contentious theological debate, but regrettably can also spill over into violence and bloodshed. As we turn to the heart of this course, we will seek to understand the faith and history of Islam, its ideals and realities, the inspiration and guidance that so many Muslims have found in their Islamic faith across time and space. At the same time, we will want to examine the challenges and diverse responses of Muslims to life in the 20th and now the 21st centuries. Thus, we shall address basic questions. What are the basic beliefs and practices that unify all Muslims? Who was the Prophet Muhammad, and what is the Quran? Why and how do they continue to be so influential in Muslim faith and life? How did the Muslim community grow and develop? What was the relationship of religion to politics and society? Why are Islamic law and mysticism so important for an understanding of Islam? How has religion affected Muslim women and the family, past and present? What is Islamic revivalism or fundamentalism? How have Muslims responded to modernity? What are the challenges that Islam and Muslims face in the 21st century?
the 5 pillars of Islam.
When we look at Islam today, as in the past, we see a unity and a diversity. Whether rich or poor, educated or uneducated, first world or third world, urban or rural, African, Asian or American. However different, there is one thing that binds all Muslims together: the 5 pillars of Islam. These are the essential observances or practices. Despite enormous religious, cultural, and political differences and divisions, all come together. Whether it's to pray 5 times a day, to go on pilgrimage, or to offer the zakat or the tithing. These and others we'll be discussing today as we look at the pillars of Islam. For the pillars of Islam are, in fact, the core and common denominator that not only unite all Muslims, but distinguish Islam from other religions. As we'll see, they are actually very brief and quite easy to understand or get down. Meeting these obligations reinforces the ongoing sense of God's existence in Muslim life every day. It reminds Muslims of their membership in a worldwide community of believers. The first pillar of Islam, the declaration or confession of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. A Muslim, therefore, is one who bears witness and testifies there is no God but God, Allah the God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. The Shahada, the bearing witness, will be pronounced and heard some 14 times each day by Muslims who pray 5 times a day, and in fact at many other times and occasion in a Muslim's life. Allah, literally the God, is the Arabic word for God, very much as Yahweh is the Hebrew word for God, to be found in the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament, and Deus, the Latin word for God, used for centuries in the Roman Catholic Mass. But who is this God? Allah is a God of might and majesty, of compassion and judgment. He is the creator, preserver, sustainer, and Lord of the universe, the revealer and the just judge. As the Quran says, He is Allah, there is no God but He. He is the knower of the invisible and the visible. He is the merciful and the compassionate. He is Allah, there is no God but He. He is the sovereign, the holy, the peaceable, the keeper of faith, the preserver, the mighty, the compeller, the sublime. Glorified be Allah above all they associate with Him. And so to become a Muslim, one need only make this brief, simple confession of faith. Again, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. For those of us who are used to Christian creeds and going to Christian services, one can appreciate the difference between what seems to be this simple sentence, however profound the beliefs behind it, and the rather lengthy variety of Christian creeds that we see in Christianity. The proclamation of this declaration affirms Islam's absolute monotheism, its uncompromising belief in the oneness of God, the doctrine of Tawheed, God's unity, and the idea that associating anything with God is idolatry. To associate not only other gods, but to associate other people, other values. This is the one unforgivable sin for those who do not repent. Thus, for example, in Islamic art, religious art, Islamic art tends to rely upon the abstract. You will not see a presentation of God, you will not see a presentation of Muhammad, and indeed the human form tends to be marginalized, although there are exceptions. But certainly within Arab culture that has been the case. And this is certainly true if one looks at the art and architecture of mosques. The second part of the Confession of Faith asserts that Muhammad is not only a prophet, but also a messenger of God. This may take some of us a second to realize this distinction. In Islam, you have both prophets and messengers. And so Muhammad is not only coming as a prophet, as a warner, as a reformer, but he is a messenger, somebody who brings a revelation, who brings a book. For Muslims, Muhammad is the final prophet and the final vehicle. He brings the final and complete revelation of the Quran. Like Jesus Christ, Muhammad serves as the preeminent role model through his life and example. Unlike Jesus, Muhammad is only a human being. Though Muslims believe that he was a perfect man, or follower of God. And so the believer's effort is to follow Muhammad's example. He is the model, he is the paradigm. And so many of what the practices of the Prophet, what he said and did, came to be collected, as we'll discuss later, in a corpus of traditions or narrative stories to which Muslims look. This practical orientation of Islam then is reflected in the remaining 4 pillars of Islam. And again, note the emphasis throughout now on observance, on, if you will, orthopraxy, right practice or observance, rather than necessarily orthodoxy. The second pillar of Islam is prayer or worship, salat. Muslims pray, or perhaps worship more correctly, 5 times a day. Daybreak, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and evening. In this way, the entire day is sanctified as they remember, worship, and find guidance in God. One experiences, in a sense, the presence of God. And this is to be found and captured in the Quran, where God says, I am near, I answer the appeal of the prayerful one, whenever he appeals to me. Let them respond to me and believe in me, so they can be directed. Chapter 2, verse 185. In many Muslim countries, reminders to pray or calls to prayer echo out across the rooftops. The muezzin gives the call to prayer. Indeed, modern technology has developed its own novel ways of handling this. From audio and visual reminders to wristwatches, clocks in the shape of mosques, certainly in the old days, I'm not sure today, most of them made in Japan, and computer programs. Salat or worship itself consists of recitation from the Quran in Arabic and the glorification of God. It's accompanied by standing, bowing, kneeling, touching the ground with one's forehead and sitting. Muslims can pray in any clean environment. They can pray alone or together, in a mosque or at home, at work or on the road, indoors, outside. It is still not uncommon in traveling in Muslim countries to see people stop on the street to pray, at a business meeting, or to see, as I have, on an airplane, or most recently, in the British Air Executive Lounge in London, a Muslim quietly going aside to face Mecca and pray. Wherever a Muslim prays, although not required, it is considered preferable and more meritorious to pray with others. This demonstrates and reinforces the common brotherhood, the sense of belonging to a common brotherhood, the sense of common equality and solidarity of that community. When they pray, Muslims face Mecca. They face the holy city of Mecca that houses the Kaaba, the house of God, believed to have been built by Abraham and his son Ismail. Originally, Muslims faced Jerusalem. Muhammad had expected that the Jews of Medina would in time accept the message of Islam. When it became clear that that wasn't the case, Muhammad received a revelation directing the change of the direction, or the Qibla, the direction for prayer, from Jerusalem to Mecca. Now, in addition to prayer 5 times a day, which can be carried on by the individual, by his or herself, once each week on Friday, the equivalent of the Sabbath, Muslims have a congregational prayer, the Jummah prayer. And here they go to mosque or to an Islamic center. Again, gathering every Friday. But it doesn't necessarily mean that one ceases work on Friday. This varies from country to country. So what is held in common is this obligation to the common congregational prayer on Friday, that this take place every week in a mosque. Now, what is a mosque? A mosque, or masjid, literally means a place of prostration. It's a building with a flat open space for Muslims to assemble to pray. Mosques, like churches and synagogues the world over, can be small and simple, or they can be grand cathedral-like structures. Some of the largest ones occurring, for example, in countries like Saudi Arabia, and more recently, the new mosque in Morocco. On one of the walls is a niche, or a mihrab, that indicates the direction, the Qibla of Mecca, the orientation point for prayer. Nearby is a pulpit or a minbar, from which the sermon at the Friday congregational prayer is given. In the courtyard or the garden, there will be a place for the faithful to wash, to perform their ablutions or ritual purification before prayer. Shoes are removed before entering the mosque, a sacred space, reminiscent of God's command in the Bible to Moses as he approached the burning bush. Take off your shoes, for the ground on which you stand is holy ground. At the end of formal ritual prayer, individuals are free then to offer personal prayers, dua. These are prayers of petition or thanksgiving to God. The third pillar of Islam is zakat, the tithe or almsgiving. Zakat literally means purification. It's both an act of self-purification and a social obligation. Payment of this tithe purifies, therefore, not only a person's soul, but also what is given or distributed to people. It reminds Muslims, and this is the most important point, that their wealth is a gift from God, that they have an obligation to share that wealth with others. And we find, again, common variants on this in Judaism and Christianity in their forms of tithing. Zakat and salat, worship, are often mentioned in the same Quranic verse, reinforcing its significance. And indeed, an early Muslim observed, it's almost a Muslim proverb, that prayer carries us halfway to God. Fasting brings us to the door of His praises. Almsgiving procures for us admission. Zakat, importantly, is both an individual and a communal responsibility, expressing worship of and thanksgiving to God by supporting the poor. It is paid during Ramadan, the month of fast. The zakat is constituted of a 2.5% tax on an individual's total wealth and assets, not merely on annual income. So it's total wealth and assets. Thus, Islamic law stipulated very clearly and specifically those areas covered: silver and gold, animals, agricultural products. Today, modern forms of wealth, bank accounts, real estate, stocks, bonds are included. Zakat is not viewed as voluntary. It's not simply a voluntary charity. It is an obligation incumbent on all believers. For all who have received from God have an obligation to give back. It is a way of taking care of those who are poor, needy, debtors, those who travel, those who are on pilgrimage, those who seek religious knowledge. Thus, zakat functions as an informal social security, at least in the past in Muslim society and for some today. It is a way in which the poor in society, even today, can receive help from those who are in a better situation. There are other religious taxes in Islam. In Shi'i Islam, there is the khums. Khums means 1/5. And for Shi'i Muslims, they pay 1/5, an obligatory tax to their religious leaders, who then redistribute it for a variety of purposes, from educational to developing seminaries to helping orphans. And there's the more voluntary forms of almsgiving called sadaqah. But it is zakat that is the obligatory form of almsgiving on all Muslims, whether they are Sunni or Shi'i. In early Islamic times, the zakat was collected by the government, held in a central treasury, and used to help the needy to build schools, hospitals, hostels, to defray government expenses. In this way, Muslims sought to fulfill the Quranic mandate. The alms are for the poor, the needy, and those who collect and distribute them, and for redeeming slaves and captives, repaying debtors, and in the cause of God, and for travelers. Thus God commands. God is all-knowing and wise. Quran chapter 9, verse 60. In modern times, zakat has been left to the conscience of individuals. Many people give it to poorer members of the family and those in their surrounding areas, as well as to others in more distant areas. However, some governments in recent decades, like Pakistan, have attempted to reintroduce the state collection and distribution of zakat. Highly contentious. But people worry about how the government will actually use their taxes, as it were. And of course, those who really do not wish to pay all that they should be paying worry about a government that's going to go right into their bank accounts and take the money. Indeed, when it was first introduced in Pakistan, people woke up in the morning to an announcement on television, lest they suffer, I guess, undue anxiety. The fourth pillar of Islam, the fast of Ramadan, occurs once each year during the month of Ramadan, the 9th month of the Islamic lunar calendar. This, it's important to note, is the month in which the first revelation of the Quran came to Muhammad. Ramadan is a time not only of physical discipline, but also spiritual reflection. During this month-long fast, Muslims whose health permits, and that's what's important, whose health permits, must abstain from dawn to sunset from food, drink, and sexual activity. Those who are sick, pregnant, weakened by old age are exempted. Muslims on a journey may postpone and make it up later. Though rigorous, the Quran makes it crystal clear that the purpose of fasting is not to be excessively burdensome, but to foster spiritual growth. As the Quran says, O believers, fasting is enjoined on you as it was on those before you, so that you might become righteous. Fast a fixed number of days. But if someone is ill or on a journey, then complete the number of days missed. And those who find it extremely difficult should, as a penance, feed a poor person. So whoever of you is at home, let him fast for a month. And let any who are sick or on a journey set aside an equal number of days at another time to fast. God wants things to be easy for you and does not want any hardship for you. So complete the number and give glory to God for the guidance and be grateful. Chapter 2, verses 183 to 185. It's important to note here that for Muslims, fasting is not a time of gloom. People welcome it, they look forward to it. And indeed, many Muslims who are not fully observant will fast during the fast of Ramadan. So fasting is not simply an act of self-denial or asceticism. It is a discipline intended to stimulate religious reflection on our human frailty, on our dependence upon God, and to focus on our spiritual goals and values, our identity, and to respond, for Muslims to respond to the less fortunate in society. At dusk, the fast is broken, immediately with a quick light meal, usually referred to as a breakfast, breaking the fast. Families and friends share, in fact, a little bit later, a special evening meal, which follows, which is often a very opulent meal in terms of the number of foods, and indeed has very many special sweets. And I can tell you, as a Christian, particularly a Roman Catholic, who grew up with a different sense of fasting, this amazed me that you had special sweets served during that time. I remember when I was in Cairo, even though I had studied Islam, I was jet-lagged, and a Muslim friend of mine picked me up, brought me to the hotel, and said, I'll see you at breakfast. Well, I went to sleep early, and the next morning I got up, and I waited for him, and I waited all day. Finally, he called me in the middle of the afternoon, and I said, where were you? I was waiting for you for breakfast. He said, I was there last night. I said, breakfast was this morning. And I completely disconnected that during Ramadan, breakfast means the breaking of the fast. So a much different time of the day. Many, having broken the fast, go to the mosque for evening prayer, which is followed by special prayers recited only during Ramadan. Ramadan is also a special time to recite or listen to the recitation of the entire Quran. Popularly, this is done by dividing the Quran into 30 sections or portions to be recited each day of the month. You'll also see it on popular posters that are sold in many cities. Near the end of Ramadan, the 27th day, Muslims commemorate the Night of Power, or the Night of Power and Excellence. This is the night where Muhammad received the first of God's revelation. The month of Ramadan ends with one of the two great feasts, or Eids, the feast of the breaking of the fast, the Eid al-Fitr. This celebration resembles Christmas or Hanukkah in its spirit of religious joyfulness, special celebrations, gift-giving. Muslims exchange cards, much the way others send Christmas cards, Hanukkah cards, Easter cards. The fifth pillar, and probably the most well-known among non-Muslims, is the pilgrimage or Hajj to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. It occurs approximately 60 days after the end of Ramadan. Every year, more than 2 million believers, representing a tremendous diversity of cultures and languages, more than 100 countries, from all over the world, descend upon the holy city of Mecca to form one community, living out their faith, reenacting sacred events from the past. At least once in his or her lifetime, every adult Muslim who is physically and financially able is required to make this pilgrimage, putting themselves completely and totally at God's service. The ritual of the pilgrimage commemorates and reenacts events in the lives of Abraham, Hagar, and Ismail, as well as we shall see, the Prophet Muhammad. Those who participate in this pilgrimage, men wear simple white, 2 pieces of white cloth to symbolize purity as well as the unity and equality of all believers. An equality that transcends class, wealth, privilege, power, nationality, race, and color. Whether poor or rich, you put aside your tattered clothes or your Gucci wardrobe. You cannot The idea is that you can't see the difference. Women are to wear modest dress or modest clothes. Their bodies should be covered with the exception of their face, their hands, and their feet. Approaching Mecca and throughout the pilgrimage, pilgrims will cry out, "I am here, O my God. You are without any associate. I am here, I am here, I am here." And indeed many, as they leave a city like Cairo or New York, will begin to say this on the plane in anticipation. And then as they approach Mecca, at the Grand Mosque of Mecca and in the adjacent areas, pilgrims participate in rituals that symbolize key religious events. Muslim tradition teaches that those who perform the Hajj with great devotion and sincerity will be forgiven their sins. And so many of the elderly and sick will have as a hope that they will die on the Hajj having been cleansed of their sins or shortly thereafter. Among the major rituals is the circumambulation 7 times around the Kaaba, a cube-shaped building, the house of God, that house believed to have been built by Abraham and Ismail. It symbolizes, this circumambulation, the believer's entry into the divine presence, reenacting, as it were, the movement of angels around the throne of God, around the heavenly throne of God. Kaaba itself is about 40 feet long, 33 feet wide, 50 feet high, and is covered with a black cloth with richly inlaid, embroidered gold thread of Quranic verses. In its eastern corner is the black stone, about 12 inches in diameter, which tradition says came from heaven, a relic from the original Kaaba, symbolizing God's covenant with humankind. Many pilgrims seek to touch or kiss it as they pass the black stone in their circular procession around the Kaaba. Another ritual is walking or running between the nearby hills of Safa and Marwa, commemorating Hagar's frantic search in the desert for water for her son Ismail. In the midst of her running back and forth, water sprang up, as it were miraculously, from the earth, producing the well of Zamzam. And indeed, one of the rituals is drinking the water from Zamzam, and many will continue to drink water from Zamzam throughout. But also many, in small vials and bottles, bring samples of that water home to distribute to friends and family, commemorating the Hajj. According to Islamic tradition, both Hagar and Ismail are buried in an enclosed area next to the Kaaba. A ritual that some have seen, but not too many non-Muslims, unless you've seen recently some of the better programs that have showed many of the rituals of the Hajj, is the casting of 7 pebbles. It's a symbolic stoning. Pebbles are cast at a stone pillar, symbolizing Ibrahim's rejection of Satan's temptation, that Abraham not follow God's command and sacrifice his son. A climax to the pilgrimage is the assembling of these 2 million Muslims at the plain of Arafat. This is where Muhammad delivered his farewell sermon. And for as far as the eye can see, tents can be seen over valleys on the sides of mountains erected to house these pilgrims who spend hours there reflecting on God and reflecting on Muhammad's sermon, in which Muhammad said, "Hear me, O people, for I know not if I ever shall meet with you in this place after this year. I have left among you that which, if you hold fast to it, shall preserve you from all error." A clear indication, the book of God and the word of his prophet. And then Muhammad recited to them the last revelation that he had just received. "This day the disbelievers despair of prevailing against your religion. So fear them not, but fear me. This day have I perfected for you your religion, fulfilled my favor unto you, and it has been my good pleasure to choose Islam for you as your religion." And indeed, Muslims will spend hours here at the plain of Arafat, talking, exchanging news and information, as well as reflecting religiously. On the Hajj, there is this exchange of information, as there always has been, both of news, mundane, as well as sacred, and a certain amount of trading being done also. The Hajj ends with the Eid al-Adha, the feast that comes at the end of the Hajj. It is celebrated not only by those on pilgrimage, but Muslims around the world. This is the Feast of Sacrifice. It is a day for prayer, a day for sacrificing an animal, sheep, or some other acceptable animal, commemorating again Abraham's ability to substitute an animal for the sacrifice of his son, Ismail. The excess meat will be distributed to the poor. Again, this feast is one of grand celebration in which Muslim families come from far and wide, come home as it were, to celebrate. Members come together, share meals, go to the mosque. In some societies it lasts for days, even weeks. Those who have made the Hajj leave with the right to put a prefix before their name, to refer to themselves as Al-Hajj or Haji, indicating that they are pilgrims, they have made the pilgrimage. Now, we have the 5 pillars of Islam. But at times, popularly, jihad has been referred to as the 6th pillar of Islam. It's important to note that it is not the 6th pillar of Islam in any formal sense. It has no such official status. We will be dealing with jihad more extensively later when we talk about the worldview of the Quran. But I think it's important here to speak briefly to the concept of jihad, because in many ways, jihad represents the entire vocation of the Muslim. Jihad in the Quran means jihad fi sabil Allah, to struggle in the path or in the way of God. And so that struggle to be a good Muslim, as an individual and as a member of a community, is encapsulated in the term jihad. It is the struggle to realize God's will, to actualize God's will in history. It is the struggle to lead a virtuous life, to fulfill the universal mission of Islam, to spread the Islamic community. Today, popularly, it can be used to describe a personal struggle, to keep the fast of Ramadan, to be good, to fulfill family responsibilities, to be a good student, to clean up a neighborhood, to fight drugs, to work for social justice. More specifically, jihad can also mean the struggle for and defense of Islam. And in this sense, it is sometimes referred to as a sacred struggle or popularly holy war. Despite the fact that jihad is not supposed to include aggressive, offensive, as distinct from defensive warfare, this has occurred throughout history. Much as Christians develop a just war theory, but often some of those wars, the justice all depends, as with beauty, the eye of the beholder. Muslim rulers have used jihad to legitimate their imperial designs and expansion. In contemporary times, religious extremists, the assassins of Anwar Sadat, the former president of Egypt, those like Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, masterminds of terrorist attacks, carried out most recently in 9/11 and subsequently also in Indonesia. Those who engage in acts of global terrorism have often attempted to legitimate what they do by referring to them, these actions, as a jihad. But as we shall see in our discussion, the Islamic tradition is quite specific in laying out rules and regulations, not just Islamic law, but the Quran itself, in terms of when and how the defense of the community is to take place. When is it legitimate to fight? When is violence legitimate? When is it illegitimate? Who can fight? Who may not fight? Who is exempted? And so, as we bring this lesson to a close, let's think then about the 5 pillars and their importance. Because from the 7th century to today, however much Islamic faith has been subject to interpretation and reinterpretation, however much divisions have come up and differences among Muslims, however diverse culturally and politically, for all who claim to be Muslim, there are these 5 simple observances, the 5 pillars of Islam, that they share in common. There are these 5 simple things: the confession of faith, prayer, pilgrimage, fasting, tithing or almsgiving. These 5 activities are what make an observant Muslim a Muslim.
Prophet and Statesman, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam.
Last class we talked about the 5 pillars of Islam, and in particular focused on, in a sense, the foundation stones as are revealed in the Confession of Faith, God and the Prophet Muhammad. Today we'll spend some time looking at the Prophet Muhammad and his role in Islam. The origins of Islam and its prophet, like those of Judaism and Christianity, would have seemed improbable to many who were forecasting at the time. In many ways, just as some could have never thought that a slave Moses and a carpenter's son Jesus would play a major role in developing or generating 2 major world religious traditions, how much more improbable would it have seemed that an orphan, illiterate caravan manager, in many ways in the wilds of Arabia, in a country being torn by tribal strife, would in fact receive the revelation from God and become the great prophet of the 2nd largest of the world's religion. A religion that has had a global religious, political, and cultural presence and impact throughout history. The birth of Muhammad and the fact that he was both a prophet receiving and reciting God's message, as well as a statesman responsible for guiding the development of a totally new community, its military protection, politics, and social development, have had a major impact on history. It's affected the history of religions, as well as international politics, for Muslims and non-Muslims alike, for more than 14 centuries. Information about Muhammad's life, his deeds and teaching, can be found in the Quran, early biographies, and the Hadith, or tradition literature. These are narrative reports of what the Prophet said and did. Muhammad is considered by Muslims to be God's human instrument, his messenger and prophet in receiving and reporting his revelation. The story of Muhammad's life and the emergence of the Muslim community have provided a paradigm to be remembered and emulated, and thus Muhammad's words and deeds represent the model, the ideal for all believers, what some have called the living Quran. As the Quran says, "You have in the messenger of God an excellent exemplar for him who looks to God in the last day and remembers God often." Quran chapter 32, verse 21. Muslims look to Muhammad's example for guidance in all aspects of life, including how to treat friends and enemies, marital and family relationships, personal hygiene, dress, diplomacy, warfare, carrying out religious duties, how to pray, when to pray. Muhammad was a multifaceted personality who served as a religious, political, and military leader of a community state. Mohammedan Muslim tradition can best be described, characterized as a remarkable personality who inspired confidence and commitment despite persecution and oppression, a shrewd military strategist, and a pious, righteous, trustworthy, compassionate, and honest man. He was also, and is also, portrayed as a caring husband and father who through his teachings and actions sought to improve the status of all women. Let's look at the context in which Muhammad and Islam emerged. The religious message that Muhammad preached grew out of and responded to the realities of 7th century Arabia. Like all religions, Islam did not appear in a vacuum, but was influenced and responded to the political and social conditions as well as other religious traditions. The world in which Islam emerged, 7th century Arabia, was a rough neighborhood, where war was the natural state of affairs. The broader Near East, in which Arabia was located, was divided itself between 2 warring superpowers of the day, the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire on the one hand, and the Sasanian Persian Empire on the other. Each had competed with each other for world dominion. 7th century Arabia was critically located along profitable trade routes of the Orient. As a result, it was subject to the rivalry and interventions of its powerful imperial neighbors. The rise and spread of Islam was caught, though, in both local politics and fighting in Arabia, as well as the imperial warfare. Muhammad's preaching would add to this mix and would itself become a source of conflict, as the Meccans resisted, as well as conflict resolution. Arabia and the city of Mecca, in which Muhammad lived and received God's revelation, was beset by tribal raids and cycles of vengeance and vendetta. Raiding was an integral part of tribal life and society. It was the way things ran. It had established regulations and customs. Raids were undertaken to increase property and goods, such as camels, cattle, jewelry, and slaves. Bloodshed was to be avoided if at all possible, lest it lead to retaliation and vendetta, the existing primitive form of justice. Pre-Islamic Arabia was tribal in its religious, social, and political ideas, its practices, its institutions, but it was also a multi-religious environment, home to a variety of religious traditions and practices, from the prevailing tribal polytheism to Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. Pre-Islamic Arabian religion was predominantly polytheistic, reflecting this tribal nature and social structure. Variety of gods and goddesses served as the protectors of tribes. Their spirits were associated with sacred objects, trees, rocks, springs, wells. These gods and goddesses were feared and respected rather than loved, the object of cultic rituals and supplication at local shrines. Tribal and family honor were central virtues. Manliness, courage in battle, chivalry, upholding tribal and family honor was a major virtue celebrated by all the poets of the time. Pre-Islamic Arabian religion had little sense of cosmic moral purpose or individual communal moral responsibility. There was no belief in the afterlife. Justice was obtained and carried out through vengeance and retaliation. Mecca, a rising commercial center, was the main site of a great annual pilgrimage to its central shrine, the Kaaba, the cube-shaped structure that housed at this time representations of some 360 different tribal gods and goddesses. Muhammad would later conclude, having received God's revelation, that the Kaaba was the original home built by Abraham and Ismail. But the identity had been lost as polytheism had overtaken the area and had, in effect, overtaken the Kaaba. At the head of the shrine's pantheon was a supreme god called Allah, creator and sustainer of life and of the universe, but remote from everyday concerns. This pilgrimage, sponsored by the Meccans, was a very profitable endeavor, bringing money, as worshippers of the many different gods from far and wide came to this center in Mecca, where money was exchanged, where trade took place. Judaism and Christianity existed within Arabia. Alongside pre-Islamic Arabian polytheism, there were then monotheistic communities present before the rise of Islam. Muhammad would encounter them also in his travels as a merchant and caravan manager. In addition to belief in a single all-powerful God, as we'll see, again, Islam shared with Christianity and Judaism many common beliefs, from prophets and revelation to notions of eternal reward and punishment. The message of Islam was revealed at and responded then to a time of great socio-economic transition in Arabia. Cities, more precisely oasis towns, most importantly Mecca and Medina, were attracting many nomads to a more sedentary lifestyle. Mecca was emerging as a major mercantile center at the heart of new political alliances, a new social and economic order. New wealth and the rise of new commercial classes led to a greater division between classes and a growing disparity between rich and poor. Amidst this environment, Muhammad was born, a member of the most prominent tribe, the Quraysh. His father and then his mother died, and so at a very early age, Muhammad was orphaned. He was raised by his uncle Abu Talib, a well-respected and powerful member of the Quraysh, who provided protection to Muhammad both in his early years as well as to Muhammad and the community later on. In a society that marginalized orphans, Muhammad would remain sensitive to their plight, as well as the plight of widows, like his mother, throughout his life. Prior to becoming a prophet, Muhammad earned a living as a business manager for caravans. He worked for a widow named Khadijah. She was 15 years older than Muhammad. They eventually married, and interestingly enough, tradition tells us that Khadijah was the one who approached him in an offer of marriage. There was a 15-year gap between their ages, Muhammad 25, Khadijah 40. Tradition records that they had 2 sons that died in infancy infancy, and 4 daughters who survived. Khadija was, in fact, the first person to believe in the revelation of Muhammad, and in many ways, the first Muslim convert. And as we'll see, she played a pivotal role in Muhammad's life. During their 24 years of marriage, Khadija was Muhammad's only wife. As we'll discuss later, after Khadija's death, Muhammad married a number of women. Most were widows, as was the custom of the time. Others were to forge alliances, political alliances. Muhammad was a man known for his integrity, his trustworthiness, his reflective nature, and would regularly retreat to a cave on a hilltop. In 610, on a night remembered in Muslim tradition as the night of power, or the night of power and excellence, Muhammad, born in 570 and who died in 632, at the age of 40, this businessman, this caravan manager, was called to be a prophet of God. And as we shall see, would later become the religio-political leader of a Muslim community state. So prophet and statesman. Muhammad heard a voice commanding him, recite. Muhammad replied warily that he had nothing to recite. Twice more, the angel repeated and commanded, recite. Muhammad, frightened and bewildered, pleaded that he didn't know what to say. Finally, the words came to him. Recite in the name of your Lord, who has created man out of a germ cell. Recite, for your Lord is the most generous one, who has taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know. This was the first of what would be many revelations from God, communicated by an intermediary, the angel Gabriel, over a 22-year period. Like the biblical prophets before him, Amos, Jeremiah, and others, Muhammad's initial reaction was consternation, surprise, fear, reluctance. Remember, prophets weren't exactly treated very well by those in their society, because they came and basically said to the society, there's something wrong here. They were calling them back to God from what was seen as their wandering from God's path. Muhammad also feared that he might be losing his mind, or that others would dismiss him as a madman. As in so many situations, he turned to his wife Khadija, who reassured him that he wasn't crazy, that he indeed received God's revelation. They also turned to Khadija's cousin, a Christian, Waraka. Waraka said to Muhammad, surely by him in whose hand is Waraka's soul, you are the prophet of the people. The angel Gabriel, who came to Moses, has come to you. But Waraka warned Muhammad, like the Hebrew prophets, you will be called a liar, and they will treat you contemptuously, cast you out and fight you. Muhammad continued to receive his revelations then for the rest of his life, for 22 years until he died in 632. They were preserved verbatim orally and then written down by scribes, and would later be collected and compiled into the Quran. Muhammad's reformist message posed, though, an unwelcome challenge to the religious and political establishment, the priests, the tribal leaders, the businessmen of the community. For indeed, like all prophets, he was a warning. The new religious message that Muhammad preached, like that of Amos and other biblical prophets, denounced the status quo, called for social justice for the poor, for the oppressed, the most vulnerable in society, for women, children, orphans. Muhammad in the Quran condemned Arabian polytheism and put a spotlight on Meccan society's unbridled materialism, its avarice, its corruption, characterized as the condition of pre-Islamic Arabia's pagan Jahiliyyah society. That is, a society that was ignorant of Islam. The term Jahiliyyah originally referred to pre-Islamic Arabia. However, it becomes a very important term today, rich in meaning, reappropriated and reinterpreted by fundamentalists and by others within the Muslim community to describe the condition of modern society. And so, extremists will use the term Jahiliyyah to describe modern societies, their own as well as Western societies, as un-Islamic or anti-Islamic. Muhammad was also a reformer, as all the great biblical prophets were. He brought a prophetic message that summoned people to strive, to struggle, jihad, to reform their communities, to live a good life based on religious belief and not loyalty to the tribe. This insistence that each person was personally accountable, not to primary tribal customary law, but to an overriding divine law, shook the very foundations of Arabian society and custom. Muhammad's newly claimed status and authority as God's messenger, and his entreaties to believers to take action against social corruption in society, was in fact a direct threat to the powerful elites of Mecca. Muhammad proclaimed a sweeping program of religious and social reform that affected religious life and practice, business contracts, gender relations, family relations. Most importantly, the Quran rejected Arabian polytheism and insisted that there was only one true God. The oneness or unity of God, the absolute monotheism of Islam, would become the foundation stone of Muslim faith and belief. The Quran denounced corrupt practices, the practices of many merchants, and the exploitation of orphans and their inheritance rights. It condemned infanticide, spoke of the religious equality of men and women, expanded the marriage and inheritance rights of women. To uphold this deeply challenging message and mission, Muhammad and his followers would not only have to preach their message in an increasing hostile environment, but also fight, to wage a sacred struggle, to wage a jihad to stay alive. Muhammad's claim to be God's prophet and the divine revelation he proclaimed undermined traditional tribal political authority and sources of revenue, namely the revenues accrued during the annual pilgrimage, the festival to this polytheistic shrine. The first 10 years of Muhammad's preaching in Mecca, as a result, were marked by resistance, produced very limited results. The community was small and under constant pressure, suffering derision, verbal attacks, and later active persecution. The life and livelihood of the community was eventually threatened by sanctions that prevented them from doing business and were literally starving them out. The hardship may well have contributed to the death of Khadijah. It certainly contributed to the bankruptcy of Muhammad's protector, Abu Talib. Muhammad was now, and most likely, a target for assassination, with no longer the protection of his uncle. It was at this very low point in Muhammad's life that an incredible mystical experience occurred, the night journey, or ascension. One night, while sleeping near the Kaaba, Muhammad was awakened by the angel Gabriel. Muhammad mounted a mystical steed who flew him from Mecca to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, referred to in the Quran as Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, the further mosque, and its site, the Temple Mount. Here Muhammad climbed a ladder leading to the throne of God. Along the way he met the great patriarchs and prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, John the Baptist, Joseph, as well as other prophets. During his meeting with God, Muhammad received guidance. Among the guidance received was the fixing of the prayers, the daily prayers, at 5. The night journey made Jerusalem, for Muslims, the third holiest city after Mecca and Medina in Islam, and affirmed a continuity and affinity of Islam with Judaism and Christianity. That Jerusalem connection. A continuity that has theological significance, but also, regrettably, has also influenced conflict down through the ages. Faced with ever-increasing threats and persecution, in 622, Muhammad accepted an invitation from the warring clans of the city of Yathrib, which the city later renamed Medina. This was a city where peoples were locked in a cycle of vendetta and destruction. To find some way out, they looked for an arbiter, and Muhammad had that reputation I referred to before as being an honest man and a good arbiter. And he was invited to the settlement to be a binding arbitrator amidst these diverse groups. It was a testimony to his established reputation. Muhammad began sending his followers to Yathrib, which is approximately 250 miles north of Mecca. He followed a short time later himself, escaping a plot to kill him, and made his way with Abu Bakr, his companion, and the man who would later become his first successor, or caliph. Yathrib itself would later be named Medina, Medinatun Nabi, the city of the Prophet. The year 622, when this migration or hijrah took place, this migration to Medina, is centrally significant. It underscores the importance of the notion of community in Islam. The Muslim calendar begins with the year of the hijrah, the creation of the Islamic community. rather than, let's say, with the year the prophet was born, the year the prophet died, or the year that he first received the revelation. It is also this year that marks the transformation of Islam from being purely a religion of individuals to a religion that would inform state and society. In Medina, the fortunes of the Muslim community improved and thrived, resulting in the establishment of the first community state. The experience and example of Muhammad's nascent community would provide the model for later generations, both then and now. In times of danger, the twin ideals of hijrah and jihad, emigrate from a hostile anti-Islamic environment, or jihad, resist and fight against oppression and injustice, were established. Again, twin ideals that have endured throughout history. These concepts became guides, guiding principles for responding to persecution and rejection, to threats to the faith, to the security and survival of the community. In the midst of persecution or resistance to aggression, Quranic verses revealed shortly after the hijrah to Medina provided guidance concerning armed struggle and jihad. As the Quran says, leave is given to those who fight because they were wrong. Surely God is able to help them, who were expelled from their homes wrongfully for saying, our Lord is God. Quran chapter 22, verse 39. The defensive nature of this struggle or jihad is reinforced in the second chapter of the Quran, verse 190, which commands fighting against aggression and against aggressors, but warns against aggression itself. And fight in the way of God with those who fight you, but aggress not. God loves not the aggressors. Both mainstream and extremist movements and self-proclaimed holy warriors like Osama bin Laden have used the pattern of hijrah and jihad for their own purposes. We'll discuss this in later lessons. In Medina, Muhammad, therefore, was both prophet and head of state, leader of a multi-religious community comprised of Muslims and non-Muslims. The constitution or charter of Medina, established by Muhammad, sets out the rights and duties of all citizens and the relationship of the Muslim community to other communities. It reflects this religious diversity. It recognized people of the book. And so Jews and Christians who had received God's revelation through their prophets were seen as allied and allies of the community. These people of the book were entitled to live in coexistence with Muslims, retain and practice their religion in return for loyalty and payment of a head tax or a poll tax. Having established this community at Medina, the bitter conflict between Mecca and Muhammad and his followers continued. For Muhammad threatened the economic power and political authority of the Meccan leaders. And he did that with a series of raids against Meccan caravans. In addition to several key battles occurred in this ongoing conflict between the powerful Meccans and the Muslims. These are remembered by Muslim tradition as a source of inspiration and guidance. Let's take a brief look at some of them. First and foremost, Badr. The Battle of Badr took place in 624. Muslim forces, although greatly outnumbered, defeated the Meccan army in the Battle of Badr, when they were aided, as the Quran in chapter 3, verse 20 says, aided by thousands of angels who assisted them. This battle has special significance for Muslims because it represents the victory of monotheism over polytheism, good over evil, the army of God over the army of ignorance and unbelief. Badr remains an important symbol for contemporary Muslims. For example, Egypt, when it launched the 1973 Arab-Israeli War under Anwar Sadat, declared a jihad, and its code name was Operation Badr. A second and important battle was the Battle of Uhud. The Battle of Uhud fought in 625, but this was a major setback for the Muslims. They were overwhelmed by the Meccans, soundly defeated, and Muhammad himself was wounded. In 627, the Meccans decided to finish the job and mounted a battle that came to be remembered as the Battle of the Ditch. They brought the Muslims or put the Muslims under siege. However, the Battle of the Ditch, or the Battle of the Trench, proved a major turning point. Muslims dug a trench to protect themselves from the Meccan cavalry. From within their enclave, the Muslims doggedly resisted the Meccan siege. And in the end, the Meccans were forced to withdraw. The Meccan loss led to the ascendancy of Muhammad to a position of influence, of recognized influence and independence. It began the shift of the balance of power in favor of the Muslims. Here we have to deal with a very important and contentious point. Muslim-Jewish relations during that battle and shortly after, which particularly deteriorated as a result of the Battle of the Ditch. Muhammad, as you'll recall, anticipated the acceptance and eventual conversion of Jewish tribes. Thus he had had the early community pray facing Jerusalem. However, the Jews did not recognize his prophethood. And politically powerful tribes, some, like the Banu Qurayza, kept up their relations with the Quraysh, Muhammad's and the Muslims' enemy. During the Battle of the Ditch, the Quraysh encouraged the Banu Qurayza to attack Muhammad from the rear. Muhammad accused them of treason, conspiring with the enemy, and breaking their agreement under the Constitution or Charter of Medina. He moved decisively to crush them. After a 25-day siege, they surrendered, their men were executed, the women and children taken captive. Although there are many passages in the Quran that speak of Jews as people of the book, recognizing God's revelation to Moses, Muhammad's treatment of these Jewish tribes in Medina has been cited by those who charge he was anti-Semitic, as well as by Muslim extremists like Osama bin Laden to support their anti-Semitism. However, it's important to note that the tensions and ultimate violence between Muslims and Jews at that time were more political than theological or racial. Muhammad regarded them as traitors, guilty of treason, a political threat to Medina, an obstacle to the consolidation of Muslim dominance and rule in Arabia. He responded as was the custom in Arabia and in many societies in his day. Remember, this was a rough area, rough time. Indeed, Muhammad's use of warfare was comparable to the warfare that we see at times in the Old Testament, under Joshua, David, Saul, in which God sanctioned battle with God's enemies. The Muslims of Medina continued to coexist with other smaller Jewish tribes, living side by side with those who honored the covenant. They would continue to do so in later centuries in Islamic empires from Andalusia to North Africa and to the Ottoman Empire. It's important to recall that when Jews were driven out of Andalusia, out of Spain, they fled to North Africa and to the Ottoman Empire, where they were welcomed and able to continue to live and survive. Finally, in 628, a truce was struck between the Meccans and the Muslims in Hudaybiyah, allowing Muslims the right to make the pilgrimage the following year, but requiring that Muhammad end his raids with their attempt at an economic blockade of Mecca. At the same time, the truce signaled the political legitimacy of Muhammad. In 630, the feud between Mecca and Medina came to an end. After client tribes of Mecca and Medina clashed, Muhammad declared the truce broken and moved against Mecca with a large force. The Quraysh capitulated, the Meccans converted to Islam, and a Pax Islamica or Islamic order was created. In victory, Muhammad proved magnanimous and strategic, using diplomacy rather than force. Avoiding vengeance and plunder, he offered amnesty to his enemies. Regarding the Kaaba as the original house of the true religion, of true monotheism, he cleansed it of its idols, of its 360 idols. The Meccans, many of his oldest enemies, now joined, converting to Islam, some becoming leaders in the community. The conquest of Mecca established Muhammad's paramount political leadership. He continued to employ his religious message, diplomatic skills, and when necessary, force to establish Muslim rule in Arabia. Consolidation of Arabia took place in the final 2 years before his death, and so when he died in 632, all of Arabia was united under the banner of Islam. Within a matter of decades, Muhammad had initiated a major religious and historical transformation that began in Arabia but would become a global religious and political movement. He created a community based upon a common religious bond, way of life, monotheistic vision, and brought a religious synthesis that recognized and incorporated Jewish and Christian prophets and revelations and a universal mission to spread God's word and rule. It is this life, an example of the prophet, that will continue to inspire the life and development of the community, as we'll see in our remaining lessons.
God's Word, the Quranic Worldview.
We've talked about the cornerstones or the foundation stones for Islam, the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad. In our last class, we talked about Muhammad and his role, his reception of the revelation, and the way in which he then served as prophet-statesman. But central and pivotal, and most foundational, is the Quran itself. And so today we'll talk about God's Word, the Quranic worldview. Muslims believe that the Quran is the literal, eternal, uncreated Word of God, sent down from heaven to the Prophet Muhammad as a guide for humankind. Sacred scriptures exist because throughout history, God has sent his guidance to prophets so that his will may be known. For Muslims, in terms of their worldview and recognition, and certainly the Quran itself, this is especially true with regard to the great prophets of Judaism and Christianity, Moses and Jesus, and the revelations that they brought, the Torah and the Gospels. The Quran confirms the Torah and the Gospel as revelations from God, but revelations that became corrupted over time. Muslims believe that after the deaths of the prophets, extraneous non-biblical beliefs infiltrated the Torah and the Gospel, altering the original pure revelation. For example, Christian doctrines such as the elevation of Jesus from a great prophet to the Son of God, his death on the cross, the Trinity, are seen as human fabrications that distort and contradict God's original revelation and its monotheistic message. Thus, the Quran was sent as a correction rather than a nullification or abrogation of the Torah and the Gospel. Muslims therefore believe that Islam is the oldest of the monotheistic faiths, since it represents both the original and final revelation of God. So, while from a historical point of view we might say that Islam is the youngest of faiths, dating Islam in terms of the creation of the Islamic community in the 7th century, for Muslims, Islam is the religion of God. It is the religion that can be traced back through the prophets to Abraham and to God himself. And the Quran has that and embodies that original revelation. Therefore, Islam is the oldest, if you will, of religions. The Muslim scripture, the Quran, is believed to be then the final and complete word of God. The Quran and the example of the Prophet, his Sunnah, Muhammad's sayings and deeds, preserved, as we said before, in narrative traditions or hadith, are what Muslims have as their guide for daily life. They represent the foundation stones of not only Islamic faith, but also Islamic civilization. As we have seen, the Quran was revealed to Muhammad in stages over a 22-year period. First in Mecca from 610 to 622, and later in Medina, 622 to 632. The Quran was preserved in both oral and written form during the lifetime of Muhammad. That is, each of these revelations as they came, and then was collected and eventually compiled in its current format during the reign of the third Caliph Uthman, who reigned from 644 to 656. The Quran's 114 chapters and 6,000 verses, shorter in length than the New Testament, were collected rather than edited thematically or chronologically. The longer chapters, the Medinan, come first, with the shortest of the chapters, or the shorter chapters, the early Meccan revelations at the end. As we have said, the verses are organized in two broad categories. The early revelations Muhammad received in Mecca and those in Medina. The revelations to Muhammad at Mecca tend to be more concerned with religious belief and practice, while the later Medinan verses reflect the life problems and issues of the Islamic community stayed at Medina. The Quran was revealed in Arabic, and therefore Arabic is the sacred language of Islam. All Muslims, regardless of their mother tongue or country of origin, memorize and recite the Quran in Arabic, pray in Arabic. Quranic passages are central to Muslim prayer 5 times each day. Translations of the Quran are typically accompanied by an Arabic text. Not all the time, but often. Until relatively recently, translations of the Quran into local languages were resisted, even forbidden, for fear that the original text and meaning would be corrupted. Muslims believe that the Quran is a miraculous text, whose divinely inspired and revealed ideas, language, or style cannot be imitated or duplicated. There are many stories about the great poets of the time who were non-believers attempting to create poetry that would compete with the poetry of the Quran, or even being challenged to do so and failing. At the same time, there are many examples of people, both in the past and today, who hearing the Quran recited, converted to Islam. I can remember a member of the military who taught at a college that I was at, raised a Roman Catholic, educated at some of the best schools, and a convert to Islam, telling my class how he had been walking through a small street in Thailand and heard the Quran recited in a mosque, having known nothing about Islam. And it was that very recitation that drew him to the mosque and that drew him to study Islam and eventually convert to Islam. And for many Muslims, therefore, the Quran is the only miracle brought by Muhammad. The Quran has played a major role in the development of Arabic language and literature. It's been a central force in the development of Arabic linguistics, grammar, vocabulary, and syntax. Quran reciters and chanters are held in great esteem in the Muslim world. Quran recitation competitions are a popular and widespread activity. It's much like going to the opera. Stadiums are filled as people come to hear the recitation of the Quran. And the stature of reciters is significant. Audios and videos are sold in airports and in major stores in parts of town. While it used to be that native Arabic speakers seem to have the inside track, in fact, in recent years, some of these competitions have tended to be won by people from Asia and Africa, from Nigeria, Pakistan, Malaysia. Let's turn to the Quranic universe. Quranic universe, at its center, is God and creation. God, Allah, the God, and creation. The word Allah appears in the Quran more than 2,500 times. Allah is identified as the transcendent, all-powerful, all-knowing, creator, sustainer, ruler, and judge of the universe. Although transcendent and thus unknowable, God's nature is revealed in creation, His will in revelation, and He acts in history. Thus, the Quran does not reveal God per se, but God's will or law for all of creation. The Quran declares an absolute monotheism, that there is no God but the God. Thus, Muslims do not believe, as I noted before, in the doctrine of the Trinity, one God in 3 persons, which they would most find impossible to understand how one can have that belief and still be holding on to absolute monotheism. A similar basis for the rejection of the notion that Jesus, the prophet, was raised to the status of Son of God. Associating anyone or anything with God, remember, is the unforgivable sin of idolatry or associationism. Although God is all-powerful and is the ultimate judge of humankind, God is also merciful and compassionate. Every recitation of the Quran begins with the phrase, "In the name of God, the merciful and compassionate." The Muslim vision of God is a God who forgives, sustains, protects, judges, rewards, and punishes. God's mercy, therefore, is believed to permeate the entire life and milieu of the believer, as we'll see now. The proclamation of God's mercy and compassion is made in the opening verse of the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate. This phrase is used by pious Muslims at the beginning of letters, speeches, to give the kind of lecture I'm giving today if I were a Muslim. A Muslim will say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim or just Bismillahi when they drive a car, begin a meal, begin a task. God's mercy, though, exists in dialectical tension with God's role as ultimate judge. Although justice can be tempered by mercy for the repentant, justice requires punishment for those who disobey God's will. On Judgment Day, all human beings will be judged according to their deeds and will be either punished or be rewarded on the basis of their obedience or disobedience. That Quranic universe has three realms, heaven, earth, and hell, in which there are two types of beings, humans and spirits. Spirits include angels, jinn, and devils. All beings are called to obedience to God. Angels serve as a link between God and human beings. Created from light, they are immortal and sexless. They function as guardians, guardian angels, recorders and messengers, such as the angel Gabriel, who brought the revelation from God. Jinn are between angels and humans. Although invisible by nature, they can assume visible form and can be either good or bad. They, like human beings, will be rewarded or punished in the afterlife. Jinn are often portrayed as magical beings and are popularly known in the West as genies. One can think of the story of Aladdin and his lamp, or the former television series I Dream of Genie. Devils are fallen angels and jinn who tempt human beings in their earthly moral struggle. The leader of the devils is Satan, Shaitan, who is also known as Iblis. Satan represents evil, which is defined as disobedience to God. Satan's fall was caused by his refusal to prostrate himself before Adam upon God's command. The fall led to the struggle of human beings who are torn between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Human beings enjoy a special status because God breathed his spirit into the first human being, Adam. They are to be obedient to God. Created by God to be his representatives on earth, as the Quran notes, God gave the earth to human beings as a trust. It is the job of human beings to carry out God's will. Although Muslims believe in the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, in contrast to Christianity, for example, there is no doctrine of an inherited original sin in Islam. Consequently, in contrast to Christianity, there's no belief in vicarious suffering or atonement for all of humankind. The punishment of Adam and Eve is due to their own personal act of disobedience. Each person, each human being is held responsible for his or her own actions. Human beings are mortal due to their human condition, therefore, not to the sin or the fall of Adam and Eve. It is their mortality that makes them and that follows from their humanity. Thus, sin is the result of an act of disobedience rather than a state of being. Islam emphasizes the need to repent by returning to the straight path of God. This is the meaning of repentance, return to the straight path of God. There is no emphasis on shame, disgrace, or guilt in the Quran. There's an emphasis on the ongoing human struggle, jihad, to do what is right and just. The obligation of Muslims to be God's servants and to spread God's message is both an individual and a community obligation. Remember that the community is bound together by their common faith, not by tribal or family ties. This common faith is not just a matter of belief and knowledge, but is to be acted out and implemented. The Muslim community, according to the Quran and according to Islam, has a mandate and mission to create a moral, social order. Historically, this mission has provided a rationale for political and moral activism, spawning Islamic activist and revivalist movements, mainstream and extremist. The requirement to implement a just society is reflected in a number of prominent themes emphasized by the Quran. Obviously, among the most prominent, social justice. One of the most striking and controversial elements of the Quran at the time when it was revealed was its firm commitment to social justice, a significant threat to the tribal power structure. Rather than accepting the principle that the strongest are the most powerful, the Quran emphasized the responsibility of Muslims to care for and protect each other, regardless of socioeconomic status. Social justice was institutionalized by the Quran in decrees requiring the payment of an alms tax, zakat, and voluntary charity for the poor, stipulations for fixed shares of inheritance for women and children, along with other regulations for the just treatment of the dispossessed. In addition, usury, The collection of interest, exploitation, was forbidden because it served as a means of exploiting the poor. False contracts were also condemned. Moreover, the Quran and Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, teach that Muslims should make every effort, struggle, jihad to promote justice. This includes, therefore, the right to engage in armed defense, jihad, for the rights of the downtrodden, in particular women and children, as we see in the 4th chapter of the Quran, verses 74 to 76, and in the defense of victims of oppression and injustice, such as those Muslims who have been driven out of their homes unjustly by the Meccans. Throughout all of its declarations, the Quran emphasizes the responsibility of the rich toward the poor and the dispossessed. The new moral and social order called for by the Quran reflected the fact that the purpose of all actions is the fulfillment of God's will, not following the desires of tribes, nations, or self. Another major message and theme in the Quran is that men and women are equal and complementary. The revelation of Islam raised the status of women in a number of ways: prohibited female infanticide, abolished women's status as property, established women's legal capacity, and allowed women to retain control over their property. It changed marriage from a proprietary to a contractual relationship, granting women the right to receive their own dowry and also granting women financial maintenance from their husbands in divorce, for example. It also prescribed a set of conditions to limit the husband's free ability to divorce at will. Men and women are equally responsible for promoting a moral order and adhering to the 5 pillars of Islam, as the Quran in the 9th chapter, verses 71 to 72 states. The believers, men and women, are protectors of one another. They enjoin what is just and forbid what is evil. They observe regular prayers, pay zakat, and obey God and His messenger. On them will God pour His mercy. For God is exalted in power, wise. God has promised to believers, men and women, gardens under which rivers flow, to dwell therein. This verse draws added significance from the fact that it was the last Quran verse to be revealed that addressed relations between men and women. Some Muslim scholars, certainly not all, argue on the basis of both content and chronology that this verse outlines the ideal vision of the relationship between men and women in Islam, one of equality and complementarity. Related to this is the theme of love and justice in family relationships, emphasizing that it is love and justice, not cruelty, which is promoted by the Quran. Quran chapter 30 verse 21 states, "And among His signs, in this that He created for you mates from among yourselves, that you may dwell in tranquility with them. And He has put love and mercy between your hearts. Behold, verily, in that are signs for those who reflect." Quran 4:19 further commands, "O you who believe, you are forbidden to inherit women against their will, nor should you treat them with harshness. On the contrary, live with them on a footing of kindness and equity. If you take a dislike to them, it may be that you dislike a thing through which God brings about a great deal of good." Likewise, the hadith or prophetic traditions note Muhammad's respect and protection of women. Indeed, Muhammad is said to have said, "The best of you is he who is best to his wife." A major theme in the Quran that has been relevant not only in the past but the present is that of religious tolerance. The Quran clearly and strongly stresses in chapter 2, verse 256, there is to be no compulsion in religion, and that God has created not one but many nations and peoples. Many passages underscore the diversity of humankind. The Quran teaches that God deliberately created a world of diversity. Chapter 49:13 tells us, "O humankind, we have created you male and female, and made you nations and tribes, so that you might come to know one another." Muslims, like Christians and Jews before them, believe they have been called to a special, therefore, covenant relationship with God, constituting a community of believers intended to serve as an example to other nations. So diversity is inbuilt. We see this in the second chapter of the Quran, verse 143. And in establishing a just social order. Jews and Christians are regarded as people of the book, people who have also received the revelation. The Quran and Islam recognize that followers of the three great Abrahamic religions, the children of Abraham, share a common belief in the one God. All share a common hope and promise of eternal reward. As the Quran says, surely the believers and the Jews, Christians and Sabians, whoever believes in God and the last day, and whoever does right, shall have his reward with his Lord, and will neither have fear nor regret. Quran chapter 2, verse 62. Historically, as we shall discuss, while the early expansion and conquest spread Islamic rule, Muslims did not try to impose their religion on others or force them to convert. As people of the book, Jews and Christians were regarded as protected, dhimmi, protected people, permitted to retain and practice their religion, be led by their own religious leaders, be guided by their own religious laws and customs. For this protection, they paid a poll or a head tax. While by modern standards this treatment amounted to second-class citizenship in a modern nation state, in pre-modern times, as compared to Christianity, for example, it was very advanced. Of course, this position is contended today. And indeed, some Islamic reformers from Egypt to Indonesia, from Europe to America, attempt to work to re-examine their faith in light of the changing realities of societies. Like Jews and Christians before them, they seek to reinterpret the sources of their faith to produce new religious understandings that speak to religious pluralism in the modern world. Many challenge the exclusivist religious claims and intolerance of ultra-conservative, fundamentalist, and extremist Islamic leaders and groups who believe that they alone possess the true interpretation of Islam and attempt to impose it on other Muslims and on non-Muslims alike, what I call a theology of hate. The use of jihad in the Quran helps us to explain the term's varied use and misuse throughout history, and why it is such a central and, in a sense, comprehensive term. Jihad's importance, jihad as exertion or struggle, is rooted, as we talked about in an earlier lesson, in the Quran's command to struggle, the literal meaning of the word jihad, in the path of God, and in the example of the Prophet Muhammad and his early community, his companions. Jihad as struggle refers to the difficulty and complexity of living a good life, struggling against the evil in ourselves, to be virtuous, moral, making a serious effort to do good works, to help reform society. Depending on the circumstances in which one lives, it also can mean the right, indeed the duty, to fight injustice and oppression, to spread and defend Islam, to create a just society, through preaching, teaching, and if necessary, sacred struggle or holy war. The two broad meanings of jihad, non-violent and violent, are found in the Quran and expressly contrasted in a well-known prophetic tradition that reports that when Muhammad returned from battle, he said to his followers, "We return from the lesser jihad, warfare, to the greater jihad." The greater jihad, of course, is the more difficult and more important struggle against one's ego, selfishness, greed, evil. Throughout history, the call to jihad has rallied Muslims to the defense of Islam. In recent years, it has been used in wars of liberation, wars of independence, as well as wars of terror. We can see it in the decade-long Afghan jihad against Soviet occupation, in Palestine, Israel, Bosnia, Kosovo, Kashmir, and Chechnya, as well as its use by terrorists like Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Let's take a closer look now at jihad in the Quran, its violent and non-violent uses. The earliest Quranic verses dealing with the right to engage in a defensive jihad or struggle were revealed shortly after the Hijrah, the emigration of Muhammad and his followers to Medina, in flight from their persecution in Mecca. At a time when they were forced to fight for their lives, Muhammad is told, "Leave is given to those who fight because they were wrong. Surely God is able to help them, who were expelled from their homes wrongfully for saying, 'Our Lord is God.'" Chapter 22, verses 39 to 40. The defensive nature of jihad is clearly emphasized and underscored in chapter 2, verse 190. And fight in the way of God with those who fight you. But aggress not. God loves not the aggressive. At critical points throughout history, Muhammad received revelations from God that provided guidelines for the jihad. As the Muslim community grew, questions quickly emerged as to what was proper behavior during times of war. The Quran provided detailed guidelines and regulations regarding the conduct of war. Who is to fight and who is exempted? When hostilities must cease? How prisoners should be treated? Most important, verses such as chapter 2, verse 294, emphasize that warfare and the response to violence and aggression must be proportional. As the Quran says, whoever transgresses against you, respond in kind. In kind. However, Quranic verses also underscore that peace, not violence and warfare, is the norm. Permission to fight the enemy is balanced by a strong mandate for making peace. If your enemy inclines toward peace, then you too should seek peace and put your trust in God. Chapter 8, verse 61. And, had Allah wished, He would have made them dominate you. And so, if they leave you alone and do not fight you, and offer you peace, then Allah allows you no way against them. Chapter 4, verse 90. From the earliest times, it was forbidden in Islam to kill non-combatants, to kill women, children, monks, rabbis who were given the promise of immunity unless they took part in the fighting. But now let us deal with a very contentious issue, and indeed one that is raised today, the so-called sword verses. What of these verses, sometimes referred to as the sword verses, that call for the killing of unbelievers, such as, when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them and confine them, and lie in wait for them at every place in ambush. Chapter 9, verse 5. A verse aimed at the Meccans that the Muslims were fighting. This is one of a number of Quranic verses that are cited by critics to demonstrate the inherently violent nature of Islam and its scripture. These same verses have also been selectively used or abused by religious extremists to develop a theology of hate and intolerance and to legitimate unconditional warfare against unbelievers. And by unbelievers, they mean other Muslims who don't believe the way they do, as well as non-Muslims. During the period of imperial Islam, of expansion and conquest, many of the ulama, the religious scholars, enjoying royal patronage, provided a rationale for caliphs to pursue their imperial dreams and extend the boundaries of their empires. As a result, they maintained that the sword verses, these later verses, abrogated or overrode the earlier Quranic verses that limited jihad to defensive war. In fact, however, the full intent of these verses is better understood when we read the subsequent verse. When the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, is missed or distorted when quoted in isolation, for it is followed and qualified by, but if they repent and fulfill their devotional obligations and pay the zakat, the charitable tax or alms tax, then let them go their way. God is forgiving and kind. Chapter 9, verse 5. The same is true of another often quoted verse today. Fight those who believe not in God nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by God and his apostle, nor hold the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book. This is often quoted or cited without the line that follows, which is, until they pay the tax with willing submission. Chapter 9, verse 29. Throughout history, past and present, the Quran, like the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity, has been the sacred source book to which believers in every age look for inspiration and guidance. As we shall see throughout this course, because it is interpreted by human beings in diverse historical and social contexts, the Word of God has yielded multiple and diverse meanings, doctrines, and practices. We shall see in later classes dealing particularly with the rise of Islamic revivalism, the resurgence of Islam, the extent to which there is indeed today a struggle, in many ways a struggle for the soul of Islam, over the interpretation and application of Islam in contemporary society and politics.
The Muslim community, faith and politics.
For many who have observed the development of Islam, particularly in early Islamic history, they are struck by the extent to which the Prophet Muhammad was both a prophet and a statesman. And in earlier lessons, we've explored the initial relationship of religion to state and society, certainly as it became articulated within the first community at Medina. Today, we'll look at the development of faith and politics throughout history, down to the contemporary period. The history of Islam demonstrates the extent to which religion is integrally related to politics and society. Faith, power, civilization, and culture are intertwined. The development of Islam from the period of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, the first four successors following Muhammad, to the development of early Islamic empires, first the Umayyad from 661 to 750, and then the Abbasid from 750 to 1258. These empires reveal the remarkable achievements that culminated in what some call the golden age of Islamic civilization. They also help us to understand the sources of sectarianism, religious extremism, and conflict between Islam and Christianity, epitomized by the Crusades. Many of these have an influence on today's realities as well. The relationship of religion to a political order begins with the birth and the spread of Muhammad's original community, his community state at Medina. Within a century after Muhammad's death, Islam as a faith and as an Islamic empire stretched from North Africa to South Asia. Islam informed state institutions, including the caliphate, notions of citizenship, war and peace, law, taxation, education, and social services. Previously, we discussed that first Islamic community under Muhammad. The development of the caliphate began with the traumatic event, though, of Muhammad's death in 632, marking the end of direct guidance from the Prophet. The period of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs. The rightly guided caliphs, the first four ruled from 632 to 661, is regarded as the normative period of Sunni Islam and provides the ideal path to which Muslims look for inspiration and guidance today. The rightly guided caliphs were the first four successors to Muhammad. All of them were Muhammad's companions and were chosen by a process of consultation. Today we hear the words Sunni and Shi'i Muslims, the two major branches of the community. Sunni comprise 85% of the world's Muslims, and Shi'i approximately 15%. The division stems from an early disagreement and conflict over who should lead the community. The majority of Muslims, who came to be called Sunni or Sunnis, followers of the Sunnah example of the Prophet, selected Abu Bakr, Muhammad's close companion and trusted advisor, to be caliph, the successor, but his successor as political leader, not as prophet, political leader of the community. Sunni Muslims adopted the belief that leadership should pass to the most qualified person, not through hereditary succession. As caliph, Abu Bakr became the political and military leader of the community. Although he was not a prophet, the Quran had declared Muhammad to be the last of the prophets. The caliph had religious prestige as head of the community of believers, the Ummah. Now, a minority of the Muslim community, who would later come to be called Shi'i, or the party of Ali, opposed the selection of Abu Bakr as caliph, believing that succession should be hereditary, staying within the Prophet's family. Thus, they maintained that Ali, Muhammad's closest living male relative, should be the leader, imam, of the Islamic community. Ali was Muhammad's first cousin
the husband to Muhammad's daughter Fatima. She believed that the Imam, although not a prophet, is divinely inspired, sinless, and infallible. Consequently, in contrast to the Sunni Caliph, for Shi'i, the Imam is both a religious and a political leader, and serves as the final authoritative interpreter of God's will, as formulated in Islamic law. However, the majority, the Sunni opinion, prevailed. Ali was passed over for the position of Caliph 3 times. Finally gaining his place after 35 years, he was assassinated only a few years later. At his death, Muawiyah, a general and governor of Damascus, who had challenged Ali's leadership, asserted his power and established the Umayyad dynasty. Ali's followers remained disaffected. Shi'i opposition to Umayyad rule came to a head in 680, when Ali's son and Muhammad's grandson Hussein led a rebellion in an attempt to recover the leadership of the Muslim community. When popular support failed to materialize, Hussein and his followers were slaughtered by the overwhelming forces of the Umayyad army at Karbala in modern-day Iraq. The memory of this tragedy, called the martyrdom of Hussein, created a paradigm of suffering and protest that has guided and inspired Shi'i ever since. Thus, the martyrdom of Hussein proved an effective symbol for protest and mobilization during the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79, as well as the Iran-Iraq War and the Lebanese Civil War. Although Sunni and Shi'i share many fundamental beliefs and practices, their differences regarding who should succeed Muhammad and lead the community, and their struggles for power, resulted in contrasting views of the meaning of history. The Sunni majority remembers a golden age of faith and empire, marked by Islam's spread and expansion globally as a faith, world power, and civilization. Thus, success, power, and wealth are seen as evidence of God's favor and historic validation of Islam. The Shi'i minority, on the other hand, who failed in their opposition to Sunni hegemony, saw themselves as victims of the illegitimate usurpation of power by Sunni rulers at the expense of a just society. For Shi'i, history serves as the theater for the struggle of an oppressed and disinherited minority community to restore God's rule on earth over the entire Muslim community under the leadership of the Imam. Realization of this just social order remained a frustrated hope and expectation for Shi'i across the centuries. In time, though, Shi'i did enjoy political power, creating the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, which reigned from 909 to 1171, and the Safavid Empire in Iran from 1501 to 1722, and indeed the Shi'i remained as the dominant religion down to today in Iran. Shi'i branches had come to exist within decades after the creation of Shi'ism. Over time, disagreement within the community over succession led to 3 major divisions within Shi'ism itself, depending on how many imams or leaders each community recognized. The 3 divisions are the Fivers, also known as the Zaydis, the Seveners, represented today in large part by the Ismailis, who are followers of the Aga Khan, and the Twelvers, also known as the Ithna Asharis. The Twelvers are the most populous of the Shi'i. They're found as the overwhelming majority in Iran, where it remains the official religion, but also in countries like Iraq, Bahrain, and elsewhere. Shi'i believe that the last Imam went into hiding or occultation, creating the doctrine of the hidden Imam. The hidden Imam is expected to return as a Mahdi, a messianic figure, who will come at the end of time to restore the community to its rightful place and usher in a perfect Islamic society in which truth and justice will prevail. During the hidden Imam's absence, the community is to be guided by religious experts capable of interpreting Islamic law, so-called mujtahids. The most striking aspect of the early expansion of Islam and of early Islamic history was the rapidity and the success of this political expansion. Within 100 years after the death of the Prophet, Muslim empire and rule extended from North Africa to South Asia, an empire greater than Rome at her zenith. For many believers, it was proof of God's guidance and reward for their faithfulness. The Muslim expansion was marked by building, adoption, and adaptation of existing political institutions and sciences, rather than destruction. Motivated by religious fervor, but also the desire for economic rewards of conquest, plunder, booty. Although the indigenous rulers and armies of conquered countries were replaced, much of their government and bureaucracy and culture were preserved. The inhabitants of newly conquered areas were given three options. One could convert to Islam, become protected, a dhimmi minority, protected people able to practice their religion, and be protected from other invaders in exchange for payment of a head tax or poll tax. Or, if one chose to resist, then battle or the sword. Muslim rule often proved to be more flexible and tolerant than that of rule under the Byzantine or Persian empires. And so, some Christian communities, in fact, did convert. There was broader tolerance, and often the tax system was far less than under Christian rule. These early conquests sought primarily to extend Muslim rule, to gain territory and tax revenue, rather than to gain converts to Islam. Religious minorities were able to exist, as I said earlier, and practice their faith. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, Islam and Muslim political power then expanded exponentially under the Umayyads and subsequently the Abbasid caliphates. The Umayyad dynasty, which reigned from 661 to 750, ended what later generations would call the golden age of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, and turned the caliphate into a hereditary monarchy dominated by an Arab military aristocracy. Centered in Damascus, the Umayyads completed the conquest of the Persian and Byzantine empires. The Umayyads were successful in acquiring power and wealth, symbolized by the lifestyle of the flourishing cosmopolitan capital in Damascus. Remember now the movement from Medina to Damascus, and the growth of new cities. They established a strong, centralized, dynastic kingdom and empire. Although they used Islam to legitimate and rationalize their conquest, the Umayyads adopted and adapted the advanced government, institutions, and bureaucracy of the Byzantine Empire. The Umayyads met, though, with considerable opposition. Their new dynastic ambitions, imperial court, lifestyle, and materialism were considered by their critics to be innovations that undermine the older, pristine Arab Islamic way of life of the Prophet and the early community at Medina. Their strengths sowed the seeds of dissent and violence. One early opposition group was a splinter group, the Kharijites, those who secede or leave, the earliest example of radical dissent in Islam. The worldview of the Kharijites, who combined a rigorous Puritanism with a militant religious fundamentalism and exclusivism, continued to inform contemporary religious extremist groups, from the assassins of Egypt's former president Anwar Sadat to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda today. They believed in literal and absolute interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, regarding anyone who deviated from their interpretation of Islam, a non-believer, subject, therefore, to excommunication, warfare, and death. And we'll see later, this is precisely the position that Osama takes. The Shi'i were another opposition group, the followers of Ali. They also opposed the Umayyads because of their refusal to submit to Ali's authority and their illegitimate usurpation of the caliphate. In the 1970s, Shi'i would liken the Shah of Iran's authoritarian rule to that of Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyads. And it was Yazid's army, remember, that defeated Hussein at Karbala in that slaughter that came to be remembered as the martyrdom. The Umayyad dynasty came to an end, though, in 750, after a revolt that led to the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate. Under the Abbasids, who ruled from 750 to 1258, with their new capital in Baghdad, modern-day Iraq, the Islamic community peaked as an empire of wealth, political power, and cultural accomplishments. The Abbasid Caliphate ushered in an era of strong centralized government, at least in its early centuries, great economic prosperity, and a remarkable civilization. Jews and Christians, as well as Muslims, served in the Abbasid bureaucracy. Abbasid success was based upon trade, commerce, industry, and agriculture, rather than conquest. The Abbasids aligned their government with Islam and became patrons of the emerging class, this new class of ulama, religious scholars, supporting the development of Islamic scholarship and disciplines and building mosques and schools, or madrasas. Enormous wealth enabled the Abbasid caliphs to become great patrons of art and architecture, culture, resulting in the florescence of Islamic civilization. Great urban cultural centers were founded in Cordoba, modern-day Spain, Baghdad, Iraq, Cairo, Egypt, Nishapur, Iran, and Palermo, Italy, eclipsing Christian Europe. From the 7th to the 9th centuries, manuscripts were obtained from the far reaches of the empire and translated from Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and Persian into Arabic. The best works of philosophy, science, and literature from other cultures were appropriated, such as Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Hippocrates, Euclid, Ptolemy. Now, two myths pervade in terms of popular Western perceptions of the Crusades. First, that the Crusades were simply motivated by a religious desire to liberate Jerusalem, and second, that Christendom ultimately triumphed. The contrast between these myths and reality can be seen in the following. And admittedly here I'm being selective, but it's to address this kind of contrast. After Jerusalem fell to the Muslims in 638, both Christians and Jews were allowed to live in and make pilgrimages to Jerusalem under Muslim rule. This peaceful coexistence lasted for 500 years. The Crusades were the result of a combination of political events and an imperial papal power play in which Christendom was pitted against Islam, leaving a legacy of misunderstanding and distrust. The Crusades were called for by Pope Urban II, following the defeat of the Byzantine army by the Abbasids. The Byzantine emperor responded by calling upon fellow Christian rulers for help and called upon the Pope to come to the aid of Christianity to free Jerusalem and its environs from the Muslims. The Pope saw an opportunity to gain recognition for papal authority and its role in legitimating the action of temporal rulers, of emperors. Christian rulers, knights, and merchants participated, not only out of piety, and many did out of piety, but also due to political and military ambitions and the promise of economic and commercial, trade and banking rewards that were expected to accompany the establishment of a Latin kingdom in the Middle East. The appeal to religion captured the popular mind and support of many Christians who responded enthusiastically to its battle cry, "God wills it." As with all wars, both sides had their heroes and villains. In recent years, the Crusades have often been portrayed as the defense of Christianity against barbaric Muslim warriors. The overly romanticized image in the West sharply contrasts with Muslim memories as well as the record of history. When the Christian Crusaders stormed Jerusalem and established Christian sovereignty over the Holy Land in 1099, they left neither Muslim nor Jewish survivors. Women and children were massacred, and Jerusalem's holy sites were desecrated. By contrast, the Muslim army, led by Saladin, recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. The Muslim army spared civilians and left churches and shrines largely untouched. Saladin was faithful to his word and compassionate towards non-combatants. Muslim memories of Christian heroes like Richard the Lionhearted are decidedly more negative than in the West. Having accepted the surrender of Acre, Richard proceeded to slaughter all of its inhabitants, including women and children, despite his promises to the contrary. The Crusades ended in 1453, when Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, fell to the Turks and was renamed Istanbul, the seat of the Ottoman Empire. Now let us shift to the Sultanate period. The Abbasid Empire, its caliphate, fell in 1258, overrun by the Mongols. However, within a short period of time, it was replaced by a string of smaller Muslim states or governments called sultanates. They extended from Senegal in Africa to the Philippines in Southeast Asia, as Islam penetrated Africa, Central and Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe, largely through missionary work of traders and Sufi brotherhoods. Traders and Sufi brotherhoods. 3 imperial sultanates emerged. The Turkish Ottoman Empire from 1281 to 1924, the Persian Safavid Empire from 1501 to 1722, and the Indian Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent, 1520 to 1857, all of which experienced political power and a cultural florescence. All of the imperial sultanates demonstrated a common outlook and approach to state organization, support, and use of Islam, although they were different in many other ways. The rulers were generally called Sultan, the one with power, or in Iran, Shah, king. Rule was based upon a combination of military strength and religious legitimacy. The ruler served, for example, as the protector and defender of the faith. Islamic law was the official law of the state, even though rulers might also make their own regulations or laws in addition to that. Religion both supported and was supported by the state. The ulama played an important role in the state, assisting in the centralization and control of the educational, legal, and social systems, educating the military, the bureaucracy, and religious elites. They supervised and guided the application and interpretation of Islamic law and oversaw the disbursement of funds from religious endowments called waqf or waqfs for educational and social services. The imperial sultanates peaked in the 16th century. By the turn of the 18th century, their power and prosperity were in serious decline. This decline coincided with the Industrial Revolution and modernization in the West, leading to the era of European colonialism and its profound impact on Islam and the Muslim world, as we shall see later in this course. Now, it's very important to think about what was happening and what the results were and their impact on, if you will, both Muslim history and the Muslim psyche. Islam had begun, remember, in Arabia, in an area torn by tribal strife, an area with tremendous division, an area that was positioned between two empires that were fighting each other and squeezing the center, as it were. The Prophet Muhammad somehow comes and, in the mind of most Muslims, in a very ingenious way, guided by God, unites Arabia and creates a prophet-led religio-political state existing under the banner of Islam. In subsequent centuries, we see the expansion of Islam, as a religion becoming global, and we've discussed that today, but also that Islam is part of the state. And so we can talk about imperial Islam, the creation of the Umayyad Empire, the Abbasid Empire, and then even when the Mongols overran the Abbasids and it looked like this was a major turn in history, the reemergence of Islam, not only as faith, but again, as state and empire, with this vast set of sultanates from literally Timbuktu in Africa to Mindanao in Southeast Asia. Despite the ups and downs of history, with its record of failure and success, Islamic history is generally remembered by many Muslims as a time in which Islam then spread as both faith and empire. Thus, from the time of the Prophet, the 7th century, to European imperialism, roughly the 18th century, to be a Muslim was to live in a Muslim society and belong to a transnational community. And, in a sense, to have a sense of belonging to, in a sense, a kind of interconnected transnational empire. One could feel as a Muslim that you were traveling, protected, as it were, under Muslim rule from one part of the world to the next, and many did that. This vision and ideal has been challenged in recent centuries by the decline of Muslim fortunes and the subordination of much of the Muslim world to outside powers. From European colonialism, and one does not want to underestimate that impact, from European colonialism and the Cold War, the superpower rivalry, to the powerful influence of America and the West today. Muslims have struggled and continue to struggle with these formidable challenges to their faith and governance. And this will continue to be seen throughout the rest of the course. We are going to shortly look at the playing out of Islam in modern history, and how the impact of the West becomes a dominant theme from the 18th century down to today. A dominant theme affecting Muslim perceptions of the West and affecting relationships between the Muslim world and the West. But before we do that, we want to turn and take a look at the development of two institutions, Islamic law and Sufism. As it were, we want to look at the two major, if you will, paths that Muslims chose to define and pursue as they sought to follow the Quranically mandated straight path of Islam.
Paths to God, Islamic law and mysticism.
The rapid expansion of Islam brought the rise of new centers of power and wealth, as we saw last class, an influx of foreign ways and greater social stratification. The contrast between the idealized community of the Prophet and the realities of Umayyad life, dissatisfaction with abuses of power and corruption, gave rise not only to revolutionary groups like the Kharijites, whom we discussed last class, but also to two major non-revolutionary reform movements or institutions, Islamic law and Sufism, or Islamic mysticism. Historically, from the 7th to the 10th centuries, Muslim scholars formulated Islamic law. Many of the earliest scholars were in fact pious Muslims who had their jobs, their day jobs as it were, as merchants and traders, but also were serious students of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. It would only be later that they would develop into a separate professional class, the ulama, literally the learned ones, the religious scholars. These early scholars developed the science of law or jurisprudence, fiqh, meaning understanding. Understanding in order to ascertain, interpret, and apply God's guidance, the Sharia, as found in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, the example of the Prophet. Based then upon both divinely revealed prescriptions, the Quran, an example of the Prophet, and their own human interpretation, they attempted to delineate a comprehensive blueprint for Muslim life and society, what we often refer to as Islamic law or Sharia. Islamic law then was a response to real religious, political, and social concerns and issues. Piety and politics were intertwined. Those who turned to law during the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th and 9th centuries did so to limit the autonomy and power of rulers by standardizing the law and taking into its control out of the hands of the caliph or his appointed judges. So they both wanted to delineate what it meant to be a good Muslim as well as limit the power of rulers. Centers or schools of thought sprang up in Medina, in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Kufa, and in Basra, across the then existing Muslim world. While many schools were established, 4 schools came to be the major Sunni law schools: the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali law schools. And these have endured to modern times. Based then both upon revelation and human interpretation, which is called ijtihad, a very central concept which we'll talk about a lot during the course, scholars attempted to delineate a comprehensive blueprint for Muslim life and society, what it meant to be a good Muslim. Although there was general agreement on many matters, significant differences also existed, reflecting differences of interpretation, as well as the diverse geographic, social, and cultural context in which the jurists were writing. It made a difference whether you lived in a more conservative or, if you will, a more open society. The development of law flourished in particular during the 10th century under the Abbasid dynasty. Remember that the Abbasids enjoyed great wealth and became patrons of religious leaders of the sciences and the arts. The Abbasid caliphs, having led a rebellion that overthrew the Umayyads, sought to justify their revolution and legitimate their rule in the name of Islam. And so became the patrons of Islam. The study of Islamic sources and the development of Islamic studies in the Quran, the prophetic traditions or hadith, and law excelled in the hands of a new class of scholars. And here we see this class emerge. The ulama take their name from alim, the Arabic singular, which means a learned one. The ulama are the learned ones. They become, as it were, a religious class. Islamic law developed then as the ideal social blueprint for the believer, responding to the question, what should I do? If I am to be a Muslim and realize God's will, well, what does that mean concretely? How should I live my life? Islamic law springs from the basic meaning and requirement of Islam, submission to and realization of God's will. The Quran, remember, teaches that Muslims must strive or struggle, jihad, in the path, Sharia, in the path of God, to implement God's will on earth, expand and defend their community, and establish a just society. Like Judaism, and in contrast to Christianity's emphasis on doctrine, on correct belief, on orthodoxy, Islam emphasizes correct action, observance, or orthopraxy. Thus, in Islam, as in Judaism, law rather than theology enjoys pride of place as the central expression of the faith. One defines oneself in terms of whether one is an observant Muslim, just as one talks about an observant Jew. In Christianity, the tendency was to tilt towards doctrine. Though they overlap, the distinction between Sharia, God's law, and fiqh, human understanding and interpretation of law, is critical to understanding the meaning and dynamic nature of Islamic law and its possibilities for modern reinterpretation and reform today. Many say, is Islam and is Islamic law capable of change and reform? Well, we'll see the importance of these terms. Sharia in the Quran and in Islam refers specifically to divine law, for God is the only lawgiver. Islamic law, in many ways, is a broader category that encompasses the divine law and human understanding or interpretation, fiqh. And so it's an interpretation of God's law. Too often, though, Sharia is simply equated with the term Islamic law, obscuring the degree to which human interpretation influenced the final product, so that the final product is actually a combination of that which is immutable and that which is mutable or changeable due to human interpretation. The development of Islamic law was the work then of religious scholars, the ulama, rather than judges, courts, or governments. They primarily laid out the law that we find in the law books. The main divisions of law concern two broad areas. First, a Muslim's duties to God. Obligatory practices or essential observances. Here primarily those involved with worship. Think concretely of the 5 pillars of Islam. These are unchangeable. Second, a Muslim's duties to others, social transactions or relations. These would include regulations governing public life, from contract and international law to family laws governing marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Sunni Muslims recognize 4 official sources of Islamic law. The bulk of the Quran consists of broad, general, moral directives or principles, and this is the first source of law. Remember, the Quran is the book of God, the revelation. Approximately 80 prescriptions in the Quran rank as legal prescriptions in the very narrowest sense or definition of law. In other senses, you're talking about legal principles and values. And most of these come from the Medinan period, when Muhammad was establishing the first Islamic community state. The second source of law is the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet. Remember, we talked about how the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet are the foundation stones. The Prophet's Sunnah, what he said and did, which were believed to be preserved in narrative stories and reports known as traditions of the Prophet, hadith. The third source is analogical reasoning, or qiyas. It's a technique used when no clear text of the Quran or the Sunnah is directly relevant to a legal question. And so when there's no clear text that exists, then jurists were free to use their independent judgment or reasoning, called ijtihad, to examine similar situations whose principles could be applied to this new situation. This, of course, led to a great deal of diversity of opinion. The fourth source of law is the consensus, the ijma' of the community. In practice, it came to be understood as the consensus of the majority of scholars, religious scholars, the ulama, who were the guardians and interpreters of the law. In many ways, the self-proclaimed guardians and interpreters. This source originated from a tradition of the Prophet that said, "My community will never agree on an error." Now, while that tradition of the Prophet was referring to the ummah, the community in general, as I said, over time it came to be understood as the ulama, as in speaking for the community, the representatives of the community, because they were the knowledgeable ones. They knew the religious sources. Concern for justice led to the development of other subsidiary legal principles. Among them were equity, which permits exceptions to a strict or literal legal reasoning in favor of public interest, another source, public interest or human welfare, the general welfare, assuring a flexibility that enabled judges to arrive at just and equitable decisions. Now, Shia Muslims have a somewhat different set of legal sources. And most importantly, within this context, we need to note that they accept, yes, the Quran and the Sunnah, but also their own collections of the traditions of Ali and his successors as Imam. Remember in Shiism the importance of Ali and the Imams, whom they regard as supreme authorities and legal interpreters. Now, while there is a unity, an overall unity within Islamic law, it's important to note there's also a diversity. Islamic law is both a source of unity as well as difference and diversity. While the four schools of law agree in their essentials, they differ in a number of particulars, reflecting the role of individual reasoning and social custom. There'll be differences about the qualifications in terms of who you can marry, or areas that have to do with the maintenance of a wife, how much maintenance and for how long. This will vary from school to school. Individual jurists differ in their interpretation of texts. They, after all, we're using their human reason, their personal opinions, their notions of equity and public welfare. So too the diverse social backgrounds and cultural context of legal scholars. The technical term for legal scholars here is a faqih, plural, a fuqaha, to refer to the jurist or the legal scholar. That also affected their judgments and informed their interpretations. What was their social context? What was the cultural context? Thus, law schools differed about the grounds on which a woman could sue for divorce or an amount to be paid for maintenance. The differences in local customs of the more cosmopolitan and class-conscious city of Kufa, a Hanafi center, versus the more conservative Medina, where the Maliki law school developed, can be seen in the varying regulations of these law schools. A similar diversity is illustrated by the official legal opinions or interpretations, what are called fatwas. A fatwa is a legal opinion rendered by an expert, a consultant, a mufti. And we see these terms emerging more in our media. The mufti is one who advises judges and advises litigants. It's a bit like in a law case today where either the plaintiff, the defendant, might go to a prominent legal scholar at a major law school to get an opinion and then bring that to court and use that before the court. We see these differences among muftis or legal scholars and differences therefore in their fatwas in recent times, when muftis have provided contrasting opinions or fatwas in the Salman Rushdie case, for example, and in the Gulf War of 1991. The Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa found Salman Rushdie, the author of the Satanic Verses, guilty of blasphemy, and he was condemned to death. That resulted, as many of you will recall, in his going into hiding. Now, other muftis, while deploring the book, called for his trial by Islamic law, and so that difference in approach. In the Gulf War, muftis' opinions varied in providing, on the one hand, supporting positions for Iraq, or on the other, support for the U.S.-led Armada that included Arab and Muslim countries, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Similar differences of opinion have been seen more recently regarding the issue of suicide bombing and martyrdom, most particularly in Palestine, Israel today, and in that conflict. Now, a major area of Islamic law, and one that we need to mention both here and later on when we deal with the issue of women, that is in the class that we'll have on women, is Muslim family law. Because of the centrality of the community in Islam, the Muslim family as the basic unit of society enjoyed pride of place in the development and implementation of Islamic law. Muslim family law includes three major areas: marriage, divorce, and inheritance. While rulers in early Islam and today might limit, circumvent, or replace other areas of law, penal and commercial laws, for example, Muslim family law has generally remained in force. The formulation of Muslim family law has been subject to reform and widespread debate and revision since the 20th century, and we certainly see it today in the 21st century. The place of women in family law reform remains, therefore, an important, extremely sensitive, and hotly contested issue in Islam and in Muslim societies. The status of women and the family in Islamic law was the product of Arab culture, Quranic reforms, and foreign ideas and values assimilated from conquered people. The Quran introduced substantial reforms, providing new regulations and modifying local custom and practice. At the same time, much of the traditional pre-Islamic social structure and its extended family and the paramount position of males in a patriarchal society, I want to underscore the importance of patriarchal society, was incorporated. Marriage and family life are the expected norm in Islam. In contrast to Christianity, in Islam, marriage is not a sacrament but a contract between a man and a woman, or perhaps more accurately, between their families. In the traditional practice of arranged marriages, the families or guardians, not the bride and groom, are the two primary actors. The Quran introduced a number of reforms that enhanced the status of women. It recognized, for example, a woman's right to contract her own marriage and receive the dower from her husband in chapter 4, verse 4. Thus she became a party to the contract, not just an object for sale. In a society where no limitations on polygamy existed, the Quran sought to control and regulate polygamy, stipulating that a man could marry up to 4 wives, provided he could support and treat them equally. It's important to note here that the Quran did not require that a man marry 4 wives, but limited him to that number. The relationship between a husband and a wife in Islamic law is viewed as complementary, reflecting their differing characteristics, capacities, and dispositions, as well as the traditional roles of men and women, again, in the patriarchal family. The primary arena for the man is the public sphere. He's to support and protect the family. Women's primary role is that of wife and mother, managing the household, supervising the upbringing and religious training of their children. While both are equal before God and equally required to lead virtuous lives, in family matters and society, women were subordinate because of their more sheltered and protected lives and their dependency on men who had greater economic responsibilities in the extended family. Now, while divorce is permissible, both the Quran and the prophetic traditions underscore its seriousness. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "Of all the permitted things, divorce is the most abominable with God." And an authoritative legal manual describes divorce as a dangerous and disapproved procedure as it dissolves marriage. In Arab society, men could divorce at will and on whim, and women had no grounds for divorce. The Quran and Islamic law introduced guidelines based on greater equity and responsibility to constrain a man's unbridled right to divorce and to establish a woman's right to a judicial court divorce. However, these laws were often compromised by social realities and circumvented. Thus, for example, a husband was required by law to pronounce the formula for divorce, "I divorce you," 3 times, once each month, for a period of 3 months, during which a time for reconciliation was to be pursued. In fact, some men bypassed the Quranically mandated 3-month waiting period, which is found in the Quran, chapter 65, verse 1, by saying, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you," 3 times all at one time. Now, while Islamic law considered such an act unapproved or deviant, it was nevertheless legally valid. The force of patriarchy was especially evident in the requirement that women, in contrast to men, go before a court and present grounds to obtain a divorce. Patriarchy also governed the rules of inheritance in pre-Islamic Arabia, according to which all property passed to the nearest male relative of the deceased. In contrast, the Quran gave rights to wives, daughters, sisters, and grandmothers of the deceased, guaranteeing them a fixed share before the inheritance, the remainder of the inheritance, could pass to the senior male. Men still inherited more than women, a fact that reflected gender relations in a male-dominated society, as well as a male's greater economic responsibilities. In practice, however, Quranic and legal reforms were often circumvented by families whose women were either ignorant of their rights or intimidated into not pursuing them. With the creation of modern nation-states in the 20th century, many Muslim governments implemented Western-inspired legal codes. However, family law was subject to reform rather than replacement. Among the key areas of concern were marriage, polygamy and child marriages, divorce and inheritance. This process of reform often set in motion a struggle between governments and their Western-oriented elite, who legislated or imposed change from above, and the ulama, religious scholars, who saw themselves as the defenders of the tradition of Islam and as the only qualified interpreters. Reforms raised the minimum age for marriage, requiring that men obtain permission from a court to take a second wife or to divorce, and expanded the grounds for women to obtain a divorce. Faced with resistance to legal reforms, governments did not pursue systematic reform, and compromises were made. Often the penalties, fines, and imprisonment for failure to comply with the law were minimal, were relatively light. The force of religious tradition could be seen in the fact that failure to comply with reform laws rendered an act illegal but not invalid, since few governments were willing to replace Islamic law and be accused of abrogating Sharia or God's law. Thus, if a man took another wife, his second marriage would be illegal and his progeny illegitimate in the eyes of the law, but not invalid in the eyes of God, according to many Islamic jurists. The tenuousness of family law reforms became evident in Muslim countries such as Iran and Pakistan in recent decades, as conservative ulama and Islamic movements pressed for their repeal. More fundamentalist and conservative voices reject reforms as un-Islamic and motivated by Western-oriented elites. They continue to pose a major obstacle to substantive reforms. However, the momentum today for greater gender equality and the growing empowerment of women have increased pressure for and debate over substantive reform in many Muslim societies. Now we move or shift from the exterior path to the interior path, Sufism or mysticism. Like Islamic law, Sufism or Islamic mysticism began as a reform movement in the Umayyad Empire. Sufis found the emphasis on this life, in contrast to the next, on power and wealth, on Islam as a system of laws and rules, to be spiritually lacking. In contrast to the exterior path of law and duty, they emphasized the more interior path of piety and devotional love. These early Sufis or mystics were motivated by a desire to return to what they regarded as the purity and simplicity of the time of Muhammad, that led them to seek direct and personal experience now of God in this world. They pursued an ascetic lifestyle that emphasized detachment from the material world, repentance for sins, and focus on the Last Judgment. This ascetic lifestyle was symbolized by their wearing of a simple, coarse, woolen garment. Early Sufis dedicated themselves to a life of prayer, fasting, meditation on the Quran. an imitation of Muhammad. The early mystics typify the concerns and spirit of Sufism. Hassan al-Basri, who lived from 643 to 728, an eminent scholar, typifies the ascetic reaction to the extravagances, what he considered to be the decadence of imperial Islam. Thus he declared, "The lower material world is a house whose inmates labor for loss, and only abstention from it makes one happy in it. He who befriends it in desire and love for it will be made wretched by it, and his portion with God will be laid waste. For this world has neither worth nor weight with God, so slight it is." Both men and women participated in Sufism. Emphasis on ascetic detachment or renunciation of dependence on the material world was complemented by the contribution of Rabia al-Adawiyya, who died in 801, who fused asceticism with an undying devotional love of God. This combination of the ascetic with the ecstatic would permanently influence the future development of Sufism. An attractive and desirable woman, she declined all offers of marriage, not permitting anyone or anything to distract her from total dedication and commitment to God. The following words attributed to Rabia capture her selfless love and devotion. "O my Lord, if I worship you out of fear of hell, and if I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from it. But if I worship you for your own sake, then withhold not from me your eternal beauty." The spread of Sufism led to the absorption of outside influences from the new areas to which Sufism spread, from Africa to Southeast Asia. Sufism adopted and adapted a variety of mystical doctrines, ranging from the sober to the intoxicated. Because of its adoption of external un-Islamic influences, Sufis came to be in conflict often with the more orthodox, legal-oriented, legal-minded ulama or religious scholars. Their conflicts revolved around issues of authority and power. The ulama typically sought to apply the letter of the law, while Sufis were more concerned with the spirit of the law. The majority of the ulama dismissed Sufi doctrine and practice as heretical deviation from orthodoxy. Many Sufis were persecuted and even executed as a result. A prominent theologian emerged to save the day, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. He synthesized and reconciled these diverse religious and philosophical currents of his day. Trained in law, theology, and philosophy, he responded to the major theological and philosophical challenges of his times. However, his brilliant career was cut short by a spiritual and psychological breakdown. In the midst of this spiritual crisis, al-Ghazali turned to Sufism, tempering reason and law with Sufism's emphasis on religious experience and love of God. The results were captured in what many consider to be his greatest work, the revivification of the religious sciences, which synthesized law, theology, and mysticism. Law and theology were presented in terms that were acceptable to the ulama, but were grounded in direct religious experience and interior devotion. Al-Ghazali's work led to his recognition as one of Islam's greatest scholars and earned him the title of the Renewal of Islam, a title which is reserved for one individual in each century for their work in revitalizing Islam. Now, Sufi orders emerged also around the 12th century, and it is the 12th century which proved to be a turning point, both because of al-Ghazali's legitimation of Sufism and the emergence of these orders or brotherhoods that transformed Sufism into a popular mass movement, cutting across social classes and educational backgrounds. Sufism grew now beyond its more urban elite roots. Its loose voluntary groups or associations that had met in mosques or private homes were replaced now by organized brotherhoods or religious orders, tariqas, with their own distinctive institutions and international networks. By the 13th century, brotherhoods had created international networks of centers or monasteries, zawiyas, that transformed Sufism into a mass movement, whose preachers were the great missionaries of Islam. Mystics, not the military, spread the faith from Africa to Southeast Asia. Sufism became integral and pervasive to popular religious practice and spirituality in Islam. Sufi spiritual leaders or masters, sheikhs or peers, enjoyed great religious influence, authority, and power, both spiritual and material. Sufi monasteries or compounds served as spiritual, social, educational, and cultural centers. Their buildings and services included the master's residence, living quarters, a mosque, school, hospice, soup kitchen to feed the poor, a clinic to care for the sick. Many of the characteristics, though, of Sufism find similar experiences in Christianity and other faiths. Sufi orders or brotherhoods formed with centers or monasteries. The investiture of initiates or disciples included distinctive garb of the order, a discipline of body and mind. Sufis recited a litany of God's names and attributes, counting them on a string of beads similar to a rosary. The founders of Sufi orders often came to be venerated as saints. Their tombs became sites for pilgrimage and even miracles. Their birth or death commemorated and celebrated. In contrast to more austere interpretations of Islam, some Sufis used music and song as well as dance and bodily movements. The followers of great Sufi mystics, Jalal ad-Din Rumi, who died in 1273, the whirling dervishes are a prime example, and they exist down to today. Popular Sufism at times did slip into magic and superstition, as well as withdrawal from the world. Some of the major Islamic revival or reform movements of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries sought to eliminate these superstitious practices. And it indeed are these practices and the reaction to them that we will look at when we turn to the rise of Islamic revivalist movements in the 17th and 18th century and look at Islamic modernist movements in the 19th and 20th century, and indeed other reform movements existing down to the 21st century.
Islamic Revivalism, Renewal and Reform.
The Islamic world experienced a major transition from the 17th to the 20th centuries as the power, prosperity, and dynamic expansionism of imperial Islam gave way to political disintegration. It was a traumatic period. Social and moral decline spread, followed by the advent of European colonialism throughout much of the Muslim world. Islam possesses a long history and tradition of religious revival and reform in response to perceived compromises in faith and practice. Historical examples of incidents covered in previous lectures that led to the calls for religious revival and reform include the Kharijite secession during the early Islamic period and Shi'i revolts, as well as the development of Islamic law and Sufism. Islamic concepts of reform, Islah, and renewal, Tajdeed, are based in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and both call for return to these sources. Islah or reform is a Quranic term found in chapters 7, 11, and 28, for example, that describes the vocation and activities of prophets. As in Judaism and Christianity, in Islam, prophets are messengers or warners, reformers who call upon a wayward or sinful community to return to God's path. Thus, Muslim reformers called for the realignment of individual and community life with the norms of the Sharia. This Quranic mandate, coupled with God's command to enjoin good and prohibit evil, provides the time-honored rationale for Islamic reformism. Renewal, or Tajdeed, proclaims the belief that an individual, a renewer of Islam, is sent by God at the beginning of each century to restore true Islamic practice and regenerate the Muslim community by returning it to the straight path of Islam. This tradition of renewal, Tajdeed, is based on a saying of the Prophet that God will send to this ummah, Muslim community, at the head of each century, those who will renew its faith for it. It was expressed in a number of popular religious forms or beliefs. The most prominent was the idea of the Mahdi, the divinely guided one. In contrast to other reformers or revivalist leaders who simply claimed to be qualified to interpret or reinterpret Islam, a Mahdi, though not a prophet, asserted that he was a divinely appointed and inspired representative of God. While Islamic revivalists claim to simply return to the original teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, in fact, they produce new religious interpretations and cultural syntheses to guide their age. Practicing ijtihad, or personal interpretation, of the Quran and Sunnah, great revivalists in the Middle East and South Asia, like Muhammad al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, whom we shortly discuss, Shah Wali Allah, claim the right to function as interpreters or reinterpreters mujtahids, in order to purify and revitalize their societies. Implicit was the belief that the righteous community of Muhammad at Medina sets the norm that all Muslims are to follow. Pre-modern revivalist movements spread across the Islamic world in the 17th and 18th centuries, from Sudan to Sumatra, from Africa to Southeast Asia. The ideological worldviews of revivalists shared common points. The purpose of pre-modern revivalists was not to reinterpret Islam to yield new solutions, but to return to the fundamentals, to the fundamental sources of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, to establish or re-establish an authentic community, such as the community of the Prophet. For this reason, they are often popularly referred to as fundamentalist movements, those that return to the fundamentals. The process involved the creation of a socio-moral reform movement governed by Islamic law, a religious community state of true believers, in contrast to existing societies that were no longer seen as truly Islamic. Removal of foreign un-Islamic practices that had infiltrated and corrupted the community was necessary. This included a critique of the ulama, the religious scholars, reform of Sufism, rejection of taqlid, the following of tradition, here seen as the blind following of the scholars of the past, and a return, therefore, to the original teachings of the Quran and Sunnah. Struggle jihad, whether through both moral self-discipline or armed struggle, was required to reassert the rightful place of Islam in society. Muslims who resisted these measures were no longer regarded as Muslims, but were to be numbered among the enemies of God. A series of jihad revivalist movements in the late 18th and 19th centuries led in time to the establishment of several Islamic states. The Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia, and in Africa, the Fulani in what is modern-day Nigeria, the Sanusi in Libya, and the Mahdi in the Sudan. The Wahhabi movement in Arabia and the Mahdi in Africa are perhaps the best known of pre-modern Islamic movements. Each has been a formative influence on modern Muslim states, and although similar in some respects, each represents contrasting styles of leadership and reform. A religious leader, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who lived from 1703 to 1792, and a local tribal chief or prince, Muhammad ibn Saud, who died in 1765, joined forces to create a united religio-political movement that would subdue large areas of Arabia and leave a religious and political legacy that continues today in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Although popularly called the Wahhabi movement after Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, one of its founders, its own self-designation was the Unitarians, the Muwahhideen, those who practice and uphold monotheism, who worship the one true God. Abdul Wahhab, a jurist and theologian, was dismayed by the condition of his society, which he saw as having degenerated to a condition little better than pre-Islamic Arabia, the Jahiliyyah period of ignorance of Islam. He was appalled by popular religious practices, such as the veneration of Sufi saints in their tombs, which he believed compromised the unity or oneness of God, and that of the Islamic community in Arabia. Abdul Wahhab condemned these and other Sufi practices as pagan superstitions, idolatry, using the term bid'ah, which means deviation from true Islam. It's almost the equivalent of heresy in Christianity. Abdul Wahhab called for a rigorous purification of Islam, a return to fundamentals. The Wahhabi movement waged a rigorous holy war to subdue and once again unite the tribes of Arabia. The warrior missionaries were called the Brotherhood, the Ikhwan. Muslims who disagreed with them were declared enemies of God who must be fought. In contrast to the Mahdis and other revivalist movements, the Wahhabi chose to completely suppress rather than merely reform Sufism. They destroyed not only Sufi shrines, but also other sacred tombs and shrines, including the tombs of the Prophet and his companions and the tomb of Hussein, a major Shi'i holy shrine and place of pilgrimage. This act has affected Wahhabi-Shi'i relations to this day. It influenced Ayatollah Khomeini's call for the overthrow of the House of Saud, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, and conflict between the Sunni majority and Shi'i minority within Saudi Arabia. Some have claimed that Wahhabi influenced the Taliban's destruction of Buddhist monuments in Afghanistan. In contrast to the Wahhabi movement, the Mahdi of the Sudan, like other African revivalists, was a charismatic Sufi leader who initiated a reformist religio-political movement. Muhammad Ahmad, who lived from 1848 to 1885, the founder of the Mahdiya Sufi order, proclaimed himself Mahdi, the divinely guided one, in 1881. Thus he went beyond most other revivalist reformers who claimed the right to interpret Islam and instead claimed to be a divinely appointed and inspired representative of God. The Mahdi established an Islamic community, uniting his followers, and justified waging holy war against other Muslims, in this case Sudan's Ottoman Muslim rulers. He declared them infidels who disobeyed the command of his messenger and his prophet, ruled in a manner not in accord with what God had said, altered the Sharia of our master, Muhammad, the messenger of God, and blasphemed against the faith of God. Sufism was reformed, alcohol, prostitution, gambling, and music were outlawed as foreign, Ottoman, Egyptian, un-Islamic practices that had corrupted society. From 1885 to 1889, after the Mahdist forces overcame Egyptian forces, an Islamic state was established in Khartoum. The Mahdi had supreme power as God's representative, and the Sharia was its law. Now, a transition takes place in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Here, Islamic modernism of the 19th and 20th centuries comes as a response both to the continued internal weaknesses, but also very much to the external political and religio-cultural threat of European colonialism. Like many parts of the world, Muslim societies fell victim to European imperialism. When Europe overpowered North Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia in the 19th century, reducing most Muslim societies to colonies, many Muslims experienced these defeats as a religious as well as political and cultural crisis. The Muslim world lost its political and cultural sovereignty to Christian Europe, symbolizing the decline of Muslim power and the apparent loss of divine favor and guidance. Colonialism brought European armies and Christian missionaries. Europe legitimated its colonization of large areas of the underdeveloped Muslim world culturally. The French spoke of their mission to civilize, the British, the white man's burden. Missionaries accompanied the armies of bureaucrats, soldiers, traders, and teachers to spread the message of Western Christian religious and cultural superiority. Muslim response to Christian Europe's political and religious penetration and dominance varied significantly, ranging from resistance or warfare, jihad, in defense of Islam, to accommodation, if not outright assimilation, of Western values. The result of Western imperialism for Muslims was a period of self-criticism and reflection on the causes of decline. Responses span the spectrum. Secularists blamed an outmoded tradition in Islam and advocated instead a separation of religion and politics, and the establishment of a Western-modeled modern nation-state building, from political institutions and the military to education and law. Conservative religious leaders, on the other hand, including most of the ulama, attributed Muslim impotence to divergence from Islam. They variously advocated non-cooperation or rejection of the West, believing that Western Christian ideas and values were dangerous to Muslim faith and culture. They believed that any form of cultural or political accommodation of Western culture was tantamount to betrayal, surrender, if you will, treason. Some concluded that Muslims who no longer lived under Islamic rule in Islamic territory ought to consider themselves in a land of warfare. They advanced either armed struggle, jihad, or emigration, hijrah, to an Islamic territory. This was what they advised. Islamic modernists, on the other hand, sought to respond to, rather than react against, the challenge of Western imperialism. They proclaimed the need for Islamic reform through a process of reinterpretation and selective adaptation, Islamization of Western ideas and technology. Like their 18th century predecessors, Islamic modernists also blamed the internal decline of Muslim societies for their loss of power, backwardness, and inability to respond effectively to European colonialism. They particularly blamed the blind and unquestioned clinging to the past tradition, taqlid. What some regarded as a virtue following tradition, they now denounced as a blind clinging to tradition and a problem. Modernists stressed the dynamism, flexibility, and adaptability that characterized the early development of Islam, leading to achievements in law, education, and the sciences, as we saw earlier in this course. Islamic modernism sought to reinterpret Islam, to demonstrate its compatibility with modern Western science and thought, and to resist European colonialism and meet the changing circumstances of Muslim life through religious, legal, educational, political, and social reforms. Major reform movements sprang up in the Middle East and South Asia, providing a legacy to reformers and revolutionaries in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the Middle East, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who lived from 1838 to 1897, called for religious, scientific, and political reforms in order to defend Islam, strengthen the Muslim community, and ultimately regain independence from the West. He was both a political activist and, if you will, intellectual leader. Afghani's disciple or protege, Muhammad Abdu, who lived from 1849 to 1905, was one of the great religious reformers of modern Islam, whose influence extended literally from North Africa to Southeast Asia. Muhammad Abdu, a prominent member of the ulama, and in late life a Grand Mufti of Egypt, chief religious leader, focused on religious, educational, and social reform rather than politics. As had his predecessors, he blamed Muslim decline on the prevalence of un-Islamic popular religious practices, Sufi passivity and fatalism, and the rigid scholasticism of the traditionalist ulama, who had forbidden fresh religious interpretation. Abdu taught that Islam and science and reason were compatible, making it permissible for Muslims to selectively appropriate aspects of Western civilization that were not contrary to Islam. He provided an Islamic rationale for the selective integration of Islam with modern ideas and institutions. Abdu's most prominent contribution was the distinction between Islam's fundamentals, which do not change. These were limited to matters of worship, for example, the 5 pillars, and those which were subject to change, as social and historical conditions warranted. Issues related to social affairs, such as penal, commercial, and family laws. Abdu was a strong supporter of women's rights. Now, across the world in the Indian subcontinent, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who lived from 1817 to 1898, called for a modern, rational reinterpretation of Islam based upon the acceptance of the best that Western thought had to offer. Ahmad Khan responded to the fall of the Mughal Empire in 1857 and British concerns about Muslim loyalty. He advocated a bold reinterpretation of Islam that called for the acceptance of the best that Western thought had to offer. In contrast to Afghani and other Middle Eastern reformers, and even some in South Asia, he preached an acceptance of the political reality of British rule and restricted his Islamic concerns to the Muslims of India, since he believed that political resistance and appeals to pan-Islam were impractical. Ahmad Khan promoted the exercise of ijtihad, reinterpretation, as a means of boldly interpreting or reinterpreting Islam in light of its revealed sources, rather than simply using reason to get back to the original interpretations of Islam. His method departed from 18th century practices, pre-modern 18th century practices, due to his extensive use of reason, the degree to which he reinterpreted Islam, and his borrowing from the West. He taught that Islam was the religion of reason and nature, so that Islam was in total harmony with the laws of nature, and therefore compatible with modern scientific thought. He allowed reason to prevail over the text of the Quran. He called for metaphorical or allegorical rather than literal interpretation of passages that contain miraculous or supernatural language. Khan was particularly supportive of educational reforms that would allow for the development of a new generation of Muslim leaders, equipped to face the challenges and demands of modernity in the West. A later reformer in South Asia, Muhammad Iqbal, who lived from 1875 to 1938, perhaps the most important Indian reformer and poet of the 20th century, was educated in Britain and Germany. He emphasized the dynamism and creativity of Islam, arguing for a reconstruction of religious thought. Iqbal combined an early Islamic education with advanced degrees from Cambridge and Munich in law and philosophy. From the best law school, he earned his law degree and also then a PhD from Germany. This education helped him to recognize the decay and decline of the Muslim community and formulate his process of reform. During Iqbal's lifetime, the critical question of Muslim communal identity was viewed through the lens of the need for independence and national identity, apart from British. The Brits had ruled in India and were ruling. The major question was whether Muslims should join with Hindus in a broad Indian independence movement seeking the creation of a single secular nation state in which Muslims would form a permanent minority, or if Muslims should insist upon their own separate state in which they would be the majority. Iqbal believed in the importance of the Muslim community living as a religio-political state in which Islamic law must reign supreme, since he believed that Islamic law served as both a political and a moral force for Muslims. He did not recognize any separation of the spiritual and temporal, and is regarded by some as one of the fathers of modern-day Pakistan, along with Ali Jinnah. Like other Islamic modernists, Iqbal distinguished between the eternal, immutable principles of Islam and those that were the product of human interpretation, and thus subject to change. He therefore extended and redefined ijtihad, independent reasoning, and ijma', consensus, to allow or legitimate modern legislative assemblies or parliaments to provide consensus for the Muslim community. Rather than the ulama providing this, he advocated that Parliament could do this in the modern state. But he also believed that legislators should keep the advice or seek the advice of experts, including religious scholars, experts from both traditional and modern disciplines, prior to passing legislation. Iqbal was especially important for his Islamization of Western concepts like democracy and parliamentary government. He did not believe that he was creating an Islamic rationale for copying Western values. Rather, he believed that these values were inherent to Islam and the Muslim historical experience. Thus, Iqbal rejected nationalism as a Western tool for dismembering the Muslim world. Instead, he emphasized the ideal of an Islamic community that transcended ethnic, racial, and national ties. But while talking a pan-Islamic language, he also realized in the short term the need for nation states, and so supported the foundation of Pakistan as an Islamic republic. Although Islamic modernism existed in different places and contexts, Islamic modernists shared some common teachings and understandings. First of all, the modernists rejected an unquestioned return or dependence on past solutions, in favor of accepting and incorporating change, and proclaimed that Islam was the religion of reason, science, and nature. They reclaimed the progressive, creative past of Islam, the golden age, as it were, whose political and cultural fluorescence demonstrated Islam's ability to produce great empires and civilizations. They stressed that stagnation and decline were caused by blind imitation of the past, taqlid, and the continued survival and revitalization of the Muslim community required a bold reinterpretation, ijtihad, of Islam's religious sources, of Islam's religious tradition. Modernists criticized the popular religious practices of Sufism as responsible for un-Islamic and even superstitious practices that were a major source of decline. Islamic modernism had both positive and negative results. It appealed to only a small elite group of intellectuals, never developed into a popular mass movement that could implement change at a national or regional level. Modernists did not provide a systematic, comprehensive theology or program for legal reform, nor establish effective organizations to continue and implement ideas once the original charismatic leaders passed from the scene. However, it had a long-term influence by emphasizing pride in an Islamic heritage and the dynamic, progressive, rational character of Islam, helping new Muslim generations to see change as an opportunity rather than a threat, and providing the vocabulary for a new Islamic discourse for change and development. Modernists inspired educational reform and national independence movements rooted in religion that harnessed Islam for mass mobilization. Islamic modernism then produced a legacy of reinterpretation that often produced a synthesis of traditional concepts and modern thought to relate Muslim faith and religious tradition to modern realities. But at the same time, we see the emergence of modern Islamic revivalist movements, what some call fundamentalist movements. Some Muslims rejected both conservative and modernist positions, in favor of Islamic organizations and an Islamic ideology that combined religious activism and religious ideology. They thought that the conservatives or ulama were too rigid. They thought that Islamic modernists tended, in keying to the West and interpreting Islam, to be westernizers of Islam, in a sense to produce a kind of Protestant Islam or Protestantization of Islam. Two major groups that have enduring influence are the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Islamic Society or group of the Indian subcontinent. They're prominent examples of modern revivalist or neo-revivalist Islamic organizations that linked religion to activism, political and social activism. Both movements emerged in the shadow of British colonialism in the mid-20th century, in societies where anti-colonial national independence movements were active. Their leaders, the Muslim Brotherhood's Hassan al-Banna, 1906 to 1949, and the Jamaat's Maulana Abu Allah Maududi, who lived from 1903 to 1979, respectively, were pious Muslims whose upbringing and educations exposed them to Islamic education, but also to Islamic modernist thought and Western learning. Both leaders combined religion and activism. They shared a revivalist ideology and established activist organizations that remain vibrant today and have served as an example to others throughout much of the Muslim world. They are the trailblazers in many ways. Both movements were organized and garnered their ideological outlooks from the example of Muhammad in his first Islamic religio-social reformation or revolution, to the neo-revivalist movements of the 17th and 18th century. They established communities of true believers, as they saw it, who were committed to the struggle to transform society. Rather than leaving their societies, they organized their followers into an Islamically oriented community in order to form a dynamic nucleus of leaders capable of transforming society from within. Each formed an ideological fraternity that developed a well-knit socio-religious organization with a network of branches and cells. Members were trained and reinforced in their faith and commitment to create a more Islamically oriented state and society. Members underwent a period of training and ideological indoctrination that emphasized religious knowledge and moral fitness and concentrated on moral and social programs. All of this was done out of a belief that the unity of the Brotherhood of Believers must replace the religious, political, and socio-economic factions that divided and weakened the Muslim community. These societies supported religious instruction, youth work, schools, hospitals, religious publications, and social welfare projects in order to create a new generation of leaders, a new social order, a more morally oriented and stronger Muslim society. The actual means of carrying out their visions varied. The Muslim Brotherhood grew rapidly as a mass movement, expanding to include members of the lower and middle classes in both rural and urban areas. The Jamaat, on the other hand, remained a more elitist movement, particularly focused on developing a new core of well-educated and Islamically committed leaders, an alternative elite. The Muslim Brotherhood's dissatisfaction with the Egyptian government's failure to establish an Islamic state escalated into violence, and the assassination of its founder, Hassan al-Banna, culminating in repression of the Brotherhood and a long series of confrontations between the Brotherhood and government. Imprisonments, proscriptions, and executions followed. The Jamaat served as an opposition party within South Asia, in particular within Pakistan, but also in India and other parts of South Asia, working through elections and in the system and through political action, although some of its leaders from time to time, including its founder Maududi, were imprisoned. Both the Brotherhood and the Jamaat became models that inspired similar movements across the Muslim world. Their founders became the ideologues of contemporary Islamic movements, the people to be read, remembered. They influenced both mainstream and extremist movements. Both gained popular support when they addressed issues that directly concerned a cross-section of society: colonialism, dependence on the West, religious identity, a reappropriation of it, issues of poverty, illiteracy, economic exploitation, education, healthcare, involvement with the material world in the pursuit of social justice, political and social activism were critical components of the neo-revivalist message. They did not simply propagate religion, but called upon Muslims to become better and more involved in society. And indeed, it is these revivalist movements, as typified and in a sense represented by the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat-e-Islami, that, as I said earlier, provide the model across the Muslim world. Muslim Brotherhoods sprang up in Egypt, in Jordan, in Syria, throughout much of the Arab world, and influenced movements in South and Southeast Asia. The Jamaat-e-Islami and its branches could be found in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in India, in Afghanistan, and the influence of the writings of Hassan al-Banna and Maulana Maududi can be found when we look in the late 20th and 21st centuries across the Muslim world, translated with modern communications, modern printing press, modern technology, translated and disseminated literally from one part of the Muslim world to the other, from urban areas to rural areas, and had an impact then on local and national Islamic organizations and societies as they developed, both in terms of their ideology as well as their actual organization and structure. And so these new movements in countries, responding to their local or national governments, were borrowing from others, appropriating, and then they would build on them. As we turn now to the remainder of the course, we will see the impact of these movements from the mid to late 20th century and their significant impact in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
The contemporary resurgence of Islam
The Islamic world experienced a major transition from the 17th to the 20th centuries as the power, prosperity, and dynamic expansionism of imperial Islam gave way to political disintegration. It was a traumatic period. Social and moral decline spread, followed by the advent of European colonialism throughout much of the Muslim world. Islam possesses a long history and tradition of religious revival and reform in response to perceived compromises in faith and practice. Historical examples of incidents covered in previous lectures that led to the calls for religious revival and reform include the Kharijite secession during the early Islamic period and Shi'i revolts, as well as the development of Islamic law and Sufism. Islamic concepts of reform, Islah, and renewal, Tajdeed, are based in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and both call for return to these sources. Islah or reform is a Quranic term found in chapters 7, 11, and 28, for example, that describes the vocation and activities of prophets. As in Judaism and Christianity, in Islam, prophets are messengers or warners, reformers who call upon a wayward or sinful community to return to God's path. Thus, Muslim reformers called for the realignment of individual and community life with the norms of the Sharia. This Quranic mandate, coupled with God's command to enjoin good and prohibit evil, provides the time-honored rationale for Islamic reformism. Renewal, or Tajdeed, proclaims the belief that an individual, a renewer of Islam, is sent by God at the beginning of each century to restore true Islamic practice and regenerate the Muslim community by returning it to the straight path of Islam. This tradition of renewal, Tajdeed, is based on a saying of the Prophet that God will send to this ummah, Muslim community, at the head of each century those who will renew its faith for it. It was expressed in a number of popular religious forms or beliefs. The most prominent was the idea of the Mahdi, the divinely guided one. In contrast to other reformers or revivalist leaders who simply claim to be qualified to interpret or reinterpret Islam, Al-Mahdi, though not a prophet, asserted that he was a divinely appointed and inspired representative of God. While Islamic revivalists claim to simply return to the original teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, in fact, they produce new religious interpretations and cultural syntheses to guide their age. Practicing ijtihad, or personal interpretation, of the Quran and Sunnah, great revivalists in the Middle East and South Asia, like Muhammad al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, whom we shortly discuss, Shah Wali Allah, claim the right to function as interpreters or reinterpreters, mujtahids, in order to purify and revitalize their societies. Implicit was the belief that the righteous community of Muhammad at Medina sets the norm that all Muslims are to follow. Pre-modern revivalist movements spread across the Islamic world in the 17th and 18th centuries, from Sudan to Sumatra, from Africa to Southeast Asia. The ideological worldviews of revivalists shared common points. The purpose of pre-modern revivalists was not to reinterpret Islam to yield new solutions, but to return to the fundamentals, to the fundamental sources of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, to establish or re-establish an authentic community, such as the community of the Prophet. For this reason, they are often popularly referred to as fundamentalist movements, those that return to the fundamentals. The process involved the creation of a socio-moral reform movement governed by Islamic law, a religious community state of true believers, in contrast to existing societies that were no longer seen as truly Islamic. Removal of foreign un-Islamic practices that had infiltrated and corrupted the community was necessary. This included a critique of the ulama, the religious scholars, reform of Sufism, rejection of taqlid, the following of tradition, here seen as the blind following of the scholars of the past, and a return, therefore, to the original teachings of the Quran and Sunnah. Struggle jihad, whether through both moral self-discipline or armed struggle, was required to reassert the rightful place of Islam in society. Muslims who resisted these measures were no longer regarded as Muslims, but were to be numbered among the enemies of God. A series of jihad revivalist movements in the late 18th and 19th centuries led in time to the establishment of several Islamic states, the Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia, and in Africa, the Fulani in what is modern-day Nigeria, the Sanusi in Libya, and the Mahdi in the Sudan. The Wahhabi movement in Arabia and the Mahdi in Africa are perhaps the best known of pre-modern Islamic movements. Each has been a formative influence on modern Muslim states, and although similar in some respects, each represents contrasting styles of leadership and reform. A religious leader, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who lived from 1703 to 1792, and a local tribal chief or prince, Muhammad ibn Saud, who died in 1765, joined forces to create a united religio-political movement that would subdue large areas of Arabia and leave a religious and political legacy that continues today in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Although popularly called the Wahhabi movement after Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, one of its founders, its own self-designation was the Unitarians, the Muwahhideen, those who practice and uphold monotheism, who worship the one true God. Abdul Wahhab, a jurist and theologian, was dismayed by the condition of his society, which he saw as having degenerated to a condition little better than pre-Islamic Arabia, the Jahiliyyah period of ignorance of Islam. He was appalled by popular religious practices, such as the veneration of Sufi saints in their tombs, which he believed compromised the unity or oneness of God, and that of the Islamic community in Arabia. Abdul Wahhab condemned these and other Sufi practices as pagan superstitions, idolatry, using the term bid'ah, which means deviation from true Islam. It's almost the equivalent of heresy in Christianity. Abdul Wahhab called for a rigorous purification of Islam, a return to fundamentals. The Wahhabi movement waged a rigorous holy war to subdue and once again unite the tribes of Arabia. The warrior missionaries were called the Brotherhood, the Ikhwan. Muslims who disagreed with them were declared enemies of God who must be fought. In contrast to the Mahdis and other revivalist movements, the Wahhabi chose to completely suppress rather than merely reform Sufism. They destroyed not only Sufi shrines, but also other sacred tombs and shrines. including the tombs of the Prophet and his companions and the tomb of Hussein, a major Shi'i holy shrine and place of pilgrimage. This act has affected Wahhabi-Shi'i relations to this day. It influenced Ayatollah Khomeini's call for the overthrow of the House of Saud, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, and conflict between the Sunni majority and Shi'i minority within Saudi Arabia. Some have claimed that Wahhabi influenced the Taliban's destruction of Buddhist monuments in Afghanistan. In contrast to the Wahhabi movement, the Mahdi of the Sudan, like other African revivalists, was a charismatic Sufi leader who initiated a reformist religio-political movement. Muhammad Ahmad, who lived from 1848 to 1885, the founder of the Mahdiya Sufi order, proclaimed himself Mahdi, the divinely guided one, in 1881. Thus he went beyond most other revivalist reformers who claimed the right to interpret Islam and instead claimed to be a divinely appointed and inspired representative of God. The Mahdi established an Islamic community, uniting his followers, and justified waging holy war against other Muslims, in this case Sudan's Ottoman Muslim rulers. He declared them infidels who disobeyed the command of his messenger and his prophet, ruled in a manner not in accord with what God had said, altered the Sharia of our master, Muhammad, the messenger of God, and blasphemed against the faith of God. Sufism was reformed, alcohol, prostitution, gambling, and music were outlawed as foreign Ottoman Egyptian, un-Islamic practices that had corrupted society. From 1885 to 1889, after the Mahdist forces overcame Egyptian forces, an Islamic state was established in Khartoum. The Mahdi had supreme power as God's representative, and the Sharia was its law. Now, a transition takes place in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Here, Islamic modernism of the 19th and 20th centuries comes as a response both to the continued internal weaknesses, but also very much to the external political and religio-cultural threat of European colonialism. Like many parts of the world, Muslim societies fell victim to European imperialism. When Europe overpowered North Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia in the 19th century, reducing most Muslim societies to colonies, many Muslims experienced these defeats as a religious as well as political and cultural crisis. The Muslim world lost its political and cultural sovereignty to Christian Europe, symbolizing the decline of Muslim power and the apparent loss of divine favor and guidance. Colonialism brought European armies and Christian missionaries. Europe legitimated its colonization of large areas of the underdeveloped Muslim world culturally. The French spoke of their mission to civilize, the British, the white man's burden. Missionaries accompanied the armies of bureaucrats, soldiers, traders, and teachers to spread the message of Western Christian religious and cultural superiority. Muslim response to Christian Europe's political and religious penetration and dominance varied significantly, ranging from resistance or warfare, jihad, in defense of Islam, to accommodation, if not outright assimilation, of Western values. The result of Western imperialism for Muslims was a period of self-criticism and reflection on the causes of decline. Responses spanned the spectrum. Secularists blamed an outmoded tradition in Islam and advocated instead a separation of religion and politics and the establishment of a Western-modeled modern nation-state building, from political institutions and the military to education and law. Conservative religious leaders, on the other hand, including most of the ulama, attributed Muslim impotence to divergence from Islam. They variously advocated non-cooperation or rejection of the West, believing that Western Christian ideas and values were dangerous to Muslim faith and culture. They believed that any form of cultural or political accommodation of Western culture was tantamount to betrayal, surrender, if you will, treason. Some concluded that Muslims who no longer lived under Islamic rule in Islamic territory ought to consider themselves in a land of warfare. They advanced either armed struggle, jihad, or emigration, hijrah, to an Islamic territory. This was what they advised. Islamic modernists, on the other hand, sought to respond to, rather than react against, the challenge of Western imperialism. They proclaimed the need for Islamic reform through a process of reinterpretation and selective adaptation, Islamization of Western ideas and technology. Like their 18th century predecessors, Islamic modernists also blame the internal decline of Muslim societies for their loss of power, backwardness, and inability to respond effectively to European colonialism. They particularly blame the blind and unquestioned clinging to the past tradition, taqlid. What some regarded as a virtue, following tradition, they now denounced as a blind clinging to tradition and a problem. Modernists stressed the dynamism, flexibility, and adaptability that characterized the early development of Islam, leading to achievements in law, education, and the sciences, as we saw earlier in this course. Islamic modernism sought to reinterpret Islam, to demonstrate its compatibility with modern Western science and thought, and to resist European colonialism and meet the changing circumstances of Muslim life through religious, legal, educational, political, and social reforms. Major reform movements sprang up in the Middle East and South Asia, providing a legacy to reformers and revolutionaries in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the Middle East, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who lived from 1838 to 1897, called for religious, scientific, and political reforms in order to defend Islam, strengthen the Muslim community, and ultimately regain independence from the West. He was both a political activist and, if you will, intellectual leader. Afghani's disciple or protege, Muhammad Abdu, who lived from 1849 to 1905, was one of the great religious reformers of modern Islam, whose influence extended literally from North Africa to Southeast Asia. Muhammad Abdu, a prominent member of the ulama, and in late life a Grand Mufti of Egypt, chief religious leader, focused on religious, educational, and social reform rather than politics. As had his predecessors, he blamed Muslim decline on the prevalence of un-Islamic popular religious practices, Sufi passivity and fatalism, and the rigid scholasticism of the traditionalist ulama, who had forbidden fresh religious interpretation. Abdu taught that Islam and science and reason were compatible, making it permissible for Muslims to selectively appropriate aspects of Western civilization that were not contrary to Islam. He provided an Islamic rationale for the selective integration of Islam with modern ideas and institutions. Abdu's most prominent contribution was the distinction between Islam's fundamentals, which do not change. These were limited to matters of worship, for example, the 5 pillars, and those which were subject to change, as social and historical conditions warranted. Issues related to social affairs, such as penal, commercial, and family laws. Abdu was a strong supporter of women's rights. Now, across the world in the Indian subcontinent, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who lived from 1817 to 1898, called for a modern, rational reinterpretation of Islam based upon the acceptance of the best that Western thought had to offer. Ahmad Khan responded to the fall of the Mughal Empire in 1857 and British concerns about Muslim loyalty. He advocated a bold reinterpretation of Islam that called for the acceptance of the best that Western thought had to offer. In contrast to Afghani and other Middle Eastern reformers, and even some in South Asia, he preached an acceptance of the political reality of British rule and restricted his Islamic concerns to the Muslims of India, since he believed that political resistance and appeals to pan-Islam were impractical. Ahmad Khan promoted the exercise of ijtihad, reinterpretation, as a means of boldly interpreting or reinterpreting Islam in light of its revealed sources, rather than simply using reason to get back to the original interpretations of Islam. His method departed from 18th century practices, pre-modern 18th century practices, due to his extensive use of reason, the degree to which he reinterpreted Islam, and his borrowing from the West. He taught that Islam was the religion of reason and nature, so that Islam was in total harmony with the laws of nature, and therefore compatible with modern scientific thought. He allowed reason to prevail over the text of the Quran. He called for metaphorical or allegorical rather than literal interpretation of passages that contain miraculous or supernatural language. Khan was particularly supportive of educational reforms that would allow for the development of a new generation of Muslim leaders, equipped to face the challenges and demands of modernity in the West. A later reformer in South Asia, Muhammad Iqbal, who lived from 1875 to 1938, perhaps the most important Indian reformer and poet of the 20th century, was educated in Britain and Germany. He emphasized the dynamism and creativity of Islam, arguing for a reconstruction of religious thought. Iqbal combined an early Islamic education with advanced degrees from Cambridge and Munich in law and philosophy. From the best law school, he earned his law degree and also then a PhD from Germany. This education helped him to recognize the decay and decline of the Muslim community and formulate his process of reform. During Iqbal's lifetime, the critical question of Muslim communal identity was viewed through the lens of the need for independence and national identity, apart from British. The Brits had ruled in India and were ruling. The major question was whether Muslims should join with Hindus in a broad Indian independence movement seeking the creation of a single secular nation state in which Muslims would form a permanent minority, or if Muslims should insist upon their own separate state in which they would be the majority. Iqbal believed in the importance of the Muslim community living as a religio-political state in which Islamic law must reign supreme, since he believed that Islamic law served as both a political and a moral force for Muslims. He did not recognize any separation of the spiritual and temporal, and is regarded by some as one of the fathers of modern-day Pakistan, along with Ali Jinnah. Like other Islamic modernists, Iqbal distinguished between the eternal, immutable principles of Islam and those that were the product of human interpretation, and thus subject to change. He therefore extended and redefined ijtihad, independent reasoning, and ijma', consensus, to allow or legitimate modern legislative assemblies or parliaments to provide consensus for the Muslim community. Rather than the ulama providing this, he advocated that parliament could do this in the modern state. But he also believed that legislators should keep the advice or seek the advice of experts, including religious scholars, experts from both traditional and modern disciplines, prior to passing legislation. Iqbal was especially important for his Islamization of Western concepts like democracy and parliamentary government. He did not believe that he was creating an Islamic rationale for copying Western values. Rather, he believed that these values were inherent to Islam and the Muslim historical experience. Thus, Iqbal rejected nationalism as a Western tool for dismembering the Muslim world. Instead, he emphasized the ideal of an Islamic community that transcended ethnic, racial, and national ties. But while talking a pan-Islamic language, he also realized in the short term the need for nation states, and so supported the foundation of Pakistan as an Islamic republic. Although Islamic modernism existed in different places and contexts, Islamic modernists shared some common teachings and understandings. First of all, the modernists rejected an unquestioned return or dependence on past solutions, in favor of accepting and incorporating change, and proclaimed that Islam was the religion of reason, science, and nature. They reclaimed the progressive, creative past of Islam, the golden age, as it were, whose political and cultural fluorescence demonstrated Islam's ability to produce great empires and civilizations. They stressed that stagnation and decline were caused by blind imitation of the past, taqlid, and the continued survival and revitalization of the Muslim community required a bold reinterpretation, ijtihad, of Islam's religious sources, of Islam's religious tradition. Modernists criticized the popular religious practices of Sufism as responsible for un-Islamic and even superstitious practices that were a major source of decline. Islamic modernism had both positive and negative results. It appealed to only a small elite group of intellectuals, never developed into a popular mass movement that could implement change at a national or regional level. Modernists did not provide a systematic, comprehensive theology or program for legal reform, nor establish effective organizations to continue and implement ideas once the original charismatic leaders passed from the scene. However, it had a long-term influence by emphasizing pride in an Islamic heritage and the dynamic, progressive, rational character of Islam, helping new Muslim generations to see change as an opportunity rather than a threat, and providing the vocabulary for a new Islamic discourse for change and development.